Some disappearances leave no warning at all, only a short radio call that sounds calm, routine and ordinary.
Ship's name?
El Faro.
Spell that? E-L?
Oh, man. The clock is ticking. Can I please speak with a QI?
Ships, aircraft and entire crews vanish after messages that give no hint of danger. These final words become the only trace of what happened in the minutes, hours or days that followed. Richard Halliburton and the Sea Dragon. The message didn't sound like a cry for help. It didn't sound frightened or desperate or even serious. It came through the radio on the night of March 23, 1939, sent to the passenger liner President Coolidge, sailing nearby in the Pacific. The voice on the other end reported heavy seas, strong gales, and a rail nearly underwater. Then came a line that would be repeated for decades afterward. "Having a wonderful time. Wish you were here instead of me." It was signed by Richard Halliburton. Those words were strange even in the moment. The ship he was on, Sea Dragon, was a small wooden Chinese junk built in Hong Kong for a long Pacific crossing. It wasn't designed for the kind of weather roaring across the region that week. The Coolidge knew the storm was worsening and asked the Sea Dragon about its position and conditions. That light, joking sentence was the last anyone heard from Halliburton or the crew. The radio went silent. No more coordinates, no more updates. Just the sound of the storm swallowing the frequency. Halliburton was not a typical sailor. By 1939, he was one of the most famous adventurers in the United States. Born in Tennessee, educated at Princeton, he had made a name for himself through travel books, magazine essays, and a style of public storytelling that mixed bold feats with humour. He swam the length of the Panama Canal and paid the canal toll as if he were cargo. He climbed the Matterhorn in winter. He visited remote ruins, deserts and temples before mass tourism existed. His public image was built on the idea that he feared nothing and always turned danger into a story. By the late 1930s, he wanted to take on something different, a dramatic ocean voyage that he could document in a new book. The plan was to build a traditional Chinese junk, hire a small international crew, and sail from Hong Kong to San Francisco. He named the boat Sea Dragon. It looked picturesque in the water, with its curved bow and battened sails, but it was also heavy, slow, and had little tolerance for rough seas. Even before departure, some local sailors questioned whether it could handle the Pacific crossing. Halliburton pushed ahead anyway. The Sea Dragon left Hong Kong on March 4, 1939. Newspapers covered the departure because Halliburton was already a celebrity. He wrote letters and sent early radio messages describing the start of the voyage. Some were full of enthusiasm, others hinted at delays, equipment problems, and poor weather. The crew included American, Chinese, and European sailors. They were experienced enough, but the ship itself was always the bigger question. As the days passed, the weather grew worse. A strong storm system formed east of the Philippines and moved toward their path. Ships in the region reported heavy seas and unpredictable winds. The Sea Dragon, lacking both speed and the ability to maneuver quickly, was at the mercy of the waves. Still, Halliburton kept up his usual tone of humour in his messages, as if treating the storm as another story to tell when he reached the California coast. When the President Coolidge picked up the Sea Dragon's radio call that night, the situation didn't sound stable. "Southerly gale," the junk reported, "rain squalls, lee rail underwater." That alone suggested the ship was heeling dangerously to one side, nearly buried in the water. The reply, "Having a wonderful time, wish you were here instead of me," came through with a mix of bravado and irony. It may have been Halliburton's way of easing tension on board, or simply the style he always used when talking about danger. The radio man on the Coolidge tried to keep the conversation going, but the replies became faint, then vanished. No one heard from the Sea Dragon again. When Halliburton failed to reach his next scheduled check-in, concern spread quickly. The US Navy launched a search. Aircraft and ships covered a huge portion of the Pacific, tracing the coordinates of the last known message. They looked for debris, oil slicks, or any sign of the junk drifting in the waves. Nothing was found. The ocean had erased everything. The official conclusion, issued later, was that the Sea Dragon had been overwhelmed by the storm and sunk with all hands. The wave height, the wind speed, and the known weakness of the vessel all pointed to a sudden loss. In the decades that followed, the final message never stopped attracting attention. It became part of Halliburton's legend, quoted in biographies and documentaries. Writers debated whether the line was a sign of denial, courage, or simply the way he dealt with fear. Some saw it as a window into his personality, someone who met danger with a joke right until the last moment. Others wondered whether the message masked a much more serious situation on board. Historians looked closely at the ship itself. Photos taken before departure revealed rotting planks, repairs made in haste, and rigging that local sailors criticised. There were claims that the junk had been overloaded with supplies and personal belongings. A few modern maritime experts have suggested that the Sea Dragon might not have survived even mild storms, let alone the gale reported that night. Family members and readers who loved his books were left with a different kind of memory. For them, Halliburton represented a world that was still full of unknown places and personal exploration. His death didn't end that image. If anything, it froze it in place. The final radio message was repeated in newspapers, then in travel essays, then in academic work, turning into a symbol of adventure on the edge of disaster. Biographers studying Halliburton's letters often stop at that moment, the point when his voice left the radio for the last time. The message showed humour, but also the limit of humour. He was in the centre of a typhoon, the ship was struggling, the crew was exposed, yet the line remained light, as if trying to say that this too would become a story once the storm passed. For researchers today, the Sea Dragon disappearance remains one of the Pacific's quieter mysteries. There are no conspiracy theories around it, no technical puzzles like with some aviation cases, no contradictory evidence. Just a ship not strong enough for the ocean, a storm too large for it to survive, and a final radio message that carried more personality than information. And in that one sentence, the world heard Richard Halliburton for the last time, Amelia Earhart's final transmission, 1937. The sun was already bright over the Central Pacific when the first strained message came through. The radio men aboard the Coast Guard cutter Itasca leaned closer to their receivers. They had spent days preparing for this moment. Their job was simple on paper: guide Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra to Howland Island, one of the smallest and most isolated landing strips in the world. But the signal coming in didn't sound calm. Earhart's voice cut through the static with a sense of pressure that hadn't been there before. She said she couldn't see the island. From that moment, two timelines moved forward at once. One belonged to Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan, high above the ocean inside the Silver Electra, flying toward a pinpoint of land that was difficult to spot even in perfect visibility. The other belonged to the crew of the Itasca, watching the clock, watching the horizon, and listening to every fading piece of radio noise. Both timelines moved toward the same point, a position that existed only in signals, coordinates, and guesses on a map. Amelia Earhart had already flown long distances across oceans. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. She set altitude records, speed records, and became one of the most recognizable figures of aviation's early era. By 1937, her goal was to circumnavigate the globe along the equator. It was a route full of long overwater stretches, and none was more dangerous than the final Pacific crossing from New Guinea to tiny Howland Island. The Electra carried extra fuel tanks and modified navigation equipment. Noonan was experienced in celestial navigation. But everything depended on visibility, radio direction finding, and the ability to pinpoint a small speck of land in a vast ocean. As the Electra left Lae, New Guinea, in the early morning hours of July 2nd, the weather reports were mixed. No major storms, but scattered cloud layers, winds that could push the plane off course. The flight would take about 18 hours if conditions held. For much of the way, Earhart transmitted routine updates, altitude, speed, and estimated progress. Some reports were faint, others were missed by the receiving stations along the route. Noonan was believed to be using the stars for navigation until daylight arrived, making celestial readings harder. Meanwhile, on the deck of the Itasca, the crew prepared for the aircraft's arrival. The island itself was too small to be seen until an aircraft was nearly on top of it. To guide Earhart, Itasca sent radio signals at intervals, hoping she could use them to take bearings. The cutter lit smoke pots on the island to create a visible plume. They listened for her frequency and logged every attempt to reach her. For hours, nothing unusual appeared in the logs. Then, as the Electra neared the expected arrival time, the messages shifted. Earhart reportedly said she was close, but couldn't locate Howland. She mentioned receiving the Itasca's signal, but couldn't get a bearing from it. The crew tried sending stronger transmissions, they tried changing frequencies, they tried calling her again and again. The map on their plotting table began to fill with lines showing where she might be, based on estimated wind drift and speed. Each line depended on assumptions, and none could be confirmed. At around 7:42 AM local time, the Itasca received a message that immediately raised alarm. Earhart said, "We must be on you but cannot see you." Her voice sounded tight, quick. She said they were flying at 1,000 feet. The radioman grabbed pencils and updated the map again, drawing a circle of possible positions around where she believed she was. They scanned the sky. They saw nothing. Minutes later, another message came through, clearer than the others. Earhart said, "We're on the line 157-337. It was a navigation line, one that ran northwest to southeast. Pilots could follow such a line when searching for a target. If they missed the island, they could fly along that line until they crossed it. But the Pacific was wide, and even a few degrees of drift could put them far from where they needed to be." On the map in the Itasca radio room, the line 157-337 was drawn quickly across the chart. It cut through the region around Howland and extended far into open ocean. The officers assumed Earhart would fly that line until she found land. If she had drifted south, she might pass near Baker Island. If she had drifted north, she would see nothing but water. The cutter tried to respond, but Earhart seemed unable to hear them. One more message arrived. She said they were running low on fuel. The tone was sharper now. Not panicked, but focused. The crew wrote it down in silence. They didn't know how much fuel remained. They didn't know how far off course she might be. They only knew time was running out. After that, the timeline in the air went quiet. Earhart's radio became weaker and then stopped completely. The Electra did not appear overhead. It did not land on Howland. It did not send a last-second SOS. The silence grew heavier with every minute. The Itasca launched search efforts immediately. Ships spread out, scanning the waves. Aircraft joined them. They followed the 157-337 line in both directions, mile after mile. The map on the cutter's table changed again. The clean navigation lines were replaced with search grids. First tight ones close to the island, then wider ones stretching outward. Weather reports were added, sea currents were considered. Each new piece of information produced another square of ocean to check. The sound of aircraft engines overhead mixed with radio tests trying to catch even the faintest reply. But the line remained silent. The search expanded for days. Noonan's navigation skill made some rescuers think the Electra could have reached nearby atolls. Others thought winds had pushed them far off course. Some believed the plane may have ditched on the open ocean and sunk quickly. With each passing hour, the map grew bigger, and the chances of finding anything grew smaller. When the search finally ended, there were still no confirmed answers. The maps, the radio logs, and the last clear message, on the line 157-337, became the final clues. Over the years, researchers traced that line again and again across different versions of the same chart. Some expeditions searched the seafloor west of Howland, others explored uninhabited islands. The radio logs were re-examined, the weather patterns reconstructed, and every detail of that morning replayed. But the silence that followed the last transmission never changed. The one-word message from Stardust, 1947. The last Morse transmission from the aircraft came sharply at 17:41 on August 2, 1947. The message was routine at first. The crew reported their estimated arrival in Santiago. Then came a final word that made no sense to the radio operator on the ground. It was sent quickly, almost clipped, as if the operator aboard the aircraft was in a rush. The word was Stendek. When Santiago requested clarification, the word came again, and again. Then the frequency went silent. 4 minutes later, the aircraft vanished. That word, strange, precise and repeated, became the last trace of British South American Airways Flight CS-59, the Avro-Lancastrian known as Stardust. It marked the moment a routine flight transformed into one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. To understand how everything converged on that single transmission, two threads unfold at the same time. The first thread follows the aircraft and its crew as they left Buenos Aires and headed west toward the Andes. The second thread follows the decisions, assumptions and navigational errors that investigators later pieced together. forming a chain of events that ended on a mountainside hidden by cloud. The Stardust took off that afternoon with 11 people on board. The crew was experienced, an accomplished captain, 2 officers, a radio operator, and a stewardess. Their passengers ranged from business travellers to diplomats. The aircraft itself was a civilian variant of the wartime Avro Lancaster bomber, converted for long-distance routes in South America. It was fast, powerful, and suited for high-altitude flight, qualities essential for crossing the Andes. But in 1947, those flights were far from easy. The Andes were a challenge even in ideal conditions. Clouds often hid the peaks. Jet stream winds were poorly understood and rarely accounted for in navigation. A few degrees of drift or a few minutes of miscalculation could put an aircraft perilously close to unseen terrain. As the Stardust climbed toward the mountains, weather conditions deteriorated. Clouds thickened, reducing visibility. The crew climbed to around 24,000 feet, hoping to fly above the worst of the weather. At that time, navigation relied heavily on dead reckoning, estimated ground speed, and occasional radio signals. When cloud cover blocked the view of the ground, pilots had to trust their calculations. For most of the flight, nothing seemed unusual. The radio logs show routine transmissions. The aircraft appeared to be on schedule, but these logs only reflect what the crew believed, not where the aircraft actually was. Unknown to them, strong headwinds slowed their ground speed. They were moving through the air at the correct rate, but over the ground they were falling behind. The difference between airspeed and ground speed created a false sense of progress, leading the crew to think they had crossed the Andes long before they actually had. This single miscalculation shaped everything that followed. Back in Santiago, radio operators listened for the aircraft's arrival. They expected the Stardust to appear overhead soon. The estimated arrival time passed. They kept listening. Then the message arrived. Loud, clear, and ending with Stendek. The operator on the ground asked for repetition. The aircraft repeated the word, twice, each time quickly, sharply, almost as if the sender had no time to waste. Investigators later studied the message from every angle. They examined the Morse code spacing, the speed of transmission, and possible abbreviations. But nothing matched. It was not an established aviation code. It was not a weather term. It had no recognized meaning in English or Spanish. Some believed it could have been a garbled version of descend. Others thought it might have been starting descent. But nothing could be confirmed. The message remains unexplained. What is known is that the crew sent it when they believed they were approaching the Chilean side of the mountains. They likely thought they were descending toward the flat ground west of the Andes, preparing for the approach to Santiago. But they were not west of the mountains. They were still deep within them. From here, the chain of decisions appears stark. The crew believed they were clear of high terrain. They began a controlled descent. The clouds blocked any view of the ground. The engines continued at normal cruising power. There was no sign they recognized danger. Investigators concluded that the aircraft flew straight into the snow-covered eastern slope of Mount Tupungato. The impact triggered an avalanche that buried the wreckage beneath the glacier. The aircraft and everyone on board disappeared under layers of ice, remaining hidden for more than half a century. When debris finally emerged from the glacier in the late 1990s, the findings supported this scenario. Sections of fuselage, landing gear, personal items, and even fragments of engines were identified. The engines showed signs of normal power at the moment of impact. The landing gear was retracted. Nothing suggested an emergency landing or uncontrolled fall. Everything pointed to a controlled flight into terrain, a descent made under the false belief that the aircraft had already crossed the Andes. The discovery of the wreck confirmed the broad outline of the tragedy, but it did not answer the question that had haunted radio operators, investigators, and families for decades. It did not explain Stendek. Theories continued. Some suggested the message might have been scrambled by atmospheric interference. Some believed the radio operator in the aircraft was sending too quickly. Others suggested the ground operator may have misread the spacing between letters. Still others proposed that the word might relate to meteorological shorthand used at the time. But none of these explanations fully fit the transmission that was logged. The word remains as sharp as the moment it was received. 3 bursts of the same mysterious sequence. The final trace of a crew that thought they were minutes from home. Maps reconstructed after the crash show how far off course the aircraft likely was. The descent path drawn by investigators crosses straight into rising terrain hidden in cloud. The error was small on paper, just enough drift to place the aircraft in the wrong part of the mountains, but fatal in practice. In the chain of decisions, no single mistake stands out as extraordinary. Each step seemed reasonable to the crew, each choice fit the information they had, and each contributed to the moment when the aircraft vanished into the glacier. The silence that followed the final transmission lasted decades. It lasted until the ice released the first pieces of wreckage. Even then, the mystery of the last word remained untouched. Stendek. A message sent 3 times, clear, urgent, and still without a meaning. Flight 19 over the Atlantic, 1945. At 2:10 p.m. on December 5th, 1945, the first unusual message came through. The training flight of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, known as Flight 19, had been in the air for almost 2 hours. The sky over Florida was clear enough for a standard navigation exercise. The crews had flown this route many times, but the voice coming over the radio sounded tense. The flight leader said they were lost, and he said their compasses were not working. From that moment on, the timeline tightened into minutes. Each transmission arrived like another piece of a puzzle sliding out of place. The maps in the control rooms were updated again and again, with new marks, new guesses, and new arcs of where the aircraft might be drifting. The clocks kept moving forward. The fuel kept going down. Flight 19 consisted of 5 Avengers, each carrying a crew of 3. They took off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale for a 3-leg training mission over the Atlantic. The first leg was east toward the Bahamas, the second was north, the third was back west toward Florida. It was intended to be a simple overwater navigation drill, part of the regular training cycle for Navy pilots returning from the war. At first, everything appeared normal. The crews checked in at expected intervals. They tracked their headings and distances. They flew the first leg and turned north. But somewhere along the second leg, the flight leader began to worry. His compass readings did not match what he expected. He told the rest of the formation to check their own. Soon, several pilots reported their instruments were acting strangely too. The weather around them had shifted. Patches of cloud and showers obscured the horizon. The map drawn on the plotting table at Fort Lauderdale now included uncertainty zones where the flight might have drifted off course. Around 3 p.m, the first clear sign of trouble appeared in the logs. The flight leader said he believed they were over the Florida Keys. If that had been true, turning north would take them back to the mainland. But if their actual position was farther east over the Bahamas, that same turn would take them even deeper into the Atlantic. The difference between those two interpretations was enormous. On the map, one path led towards safety, the other led into open water. The flight leader ordered the formation to turn. Some of the trainees questioned the command, believing the islands below looked like the Bahamas, but the leader insisted. From the ground, instructors listening to the radio could hear the tension rising in each exchange. They tried to radio instructions back, but the signals were weak. Interference was heavy. Some messages were heard clearly, others only partially. Each fragment was written down, timed, and plotted on a growing set of charts. At around 3:30 p.m, the radio crackled with another update. The leader said, "We can't tell where we are." He asked if the base could send a powerful signal so the flight could take a bearing. The ground stations transmitted repeatedly. The crews reported hearing nothing. The more the controllers tried to reach them, the more silence they heard in return. The map in the control room changed again. Lines showing possible drift were drawn farther east, then farther southeast. The lack of strong reception suggested the aircraft were moving away from Florida, not toward it. But no one could confirm it. By 4 p.m, another layer of stress appeared in the transmissions. The pilots reported worsening weather. Rain clouds and turbulence blocked visibility. Some aircraft said they were flying low to avoid cloud. Others said they were climbing to stay above it. As the formation spread out vertically, maintaining position became harder. On the map, control officers widened the probable search area again, stretching it deeper into the ocean. Fuel became the next concern. Avengers could remain airborne for several hours, but not indefinitely. With each transmission, the voice of the leader grew more strained. He said they were running low. He suggested turning west again. The crew questioned the order, uncertain whether west would take them home or farther out to sea. The compass issues meant no one knew for sure. From the ground, attempts to guide them continued. Multiple stations transmitted strong signals, hoping the flight could triangulate their position. But the pilots either could not hear them or could not interpret the bearings. Some in the control rooms wondered whether the aircraft were too far out for reception. Others wondered whether atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction was blocking communication. As the timeline tightened toward evening, the real-time confusion settled into a pattern. The pilots kept circling. They kept trying to identify landmarks through breaks in the clouds. They kept struggling to decide whether to continue west or hold course. On the map, controllers marked new possible arcs based on wind, drift, estimated speed, and fuel burn. Each updated arc moved farther away from the coast. At around 5 p.m, the last coherent transmissions were received. The leader said they would continue on a particular heading until their fuel was exhausted. He told the formation that when the first aircraft dropped below fuel reserve limits, they would ditch together. Ditching in open ocean at night in rough winter seas was one of the most dangerous maneuvers possible for an Avenger. The aircraft tended to flip on impact. Survival time in the water could be short. The final messages came in faintly. One pilot said he could see nothing but water. Another said they were still flying west. Seconds later, the radio turned to static. The map stopped updating. The clock kept ticking. A massive search began at once. Dozens of ships and aircraft covered the arcs drawn during those frantic hours. The search grid expanded across the Bahamas, the Straits of Florida, and deep into the Atlantic. Planes flew patterns across hundreds of miles. Ships checked every oil slick and patch of debris, but no confirmed wreckage from the Avengers was ever found. To make matters worse, one of the rescue aircraft, a PBM Mariner, also disappeared that night with 13 men aboard. Some reported seeing an explosion over the water. Others believed the Mariner suffered a fuel vapor ignition, a known risk for that model. Whatever the cause, it removed one more piece from the search effort. The map of Flight 19's vanishing has been drawn and redrawn for decades. Each attempt tries to reconstruct those hours, the compass confusion, the turning back and forth, the radio fading in and out, the movement of clouds, the pull of wind. Every piece of information shows how fast a training mission turned into a real-time emergency without a single point of certainty. The final words, spoken in a quiet but tense voice, still echo in the logs. We can't tell where we are. The PBM Mariner that joined them, 1945. The PBM Mariner lifted off at 7:27 p.m, just as daylight slipped away over the Atlantic. The flight crew of 13 knew they were heading into worsening weather, searching for Flight 19, which had already been missing for hours. Their orders were clear: fly to the last estimated position of the Avengers, sweep the area, and report anything they saw. The Mariner's radio check was routine. Nothing sounded stressed. Nothing sounded unusual. The radio log noted a simple confirmation that the aircraft was on course. Then came the words, "We'll stand by." Those were the last words ever heard from the Mariner. From here, two timelines unfold in parallel. One belongs to the Avengers of Flight 19, pilots circling in confusion, sending desperate transmissions about failed compasses and fading fuel. The other belongs to the Mariner sent to bring them home, flying toward the same uncertainty with full tanks and a reputation for danger. The Mariner's place in this story is not just that it vanished, it is that it vanished minutes after a normal radio call in the middle of a search operation that was already straining every channel. The Mariner was a large twin-engine patrol flying boat, built to cover long distances and carry heavy loads of fuel. But it also carried a nickname among crews, the Flying Gas Tank. People said it because the aircraft was known for issues with fuel vapor buildup. A single spark, a single electrical arc could cause an explosion. It wasn't a rumour. It had happened before. As the Mariner climbed out over the waves that night, the crew had no way of knowing they were heading into a sequence of events that would turn the entire rescue mission into one of naval aviation's most puzzling double disappearances. In the other timeline, the one of Flight 19, the Avengers were already believed to be far off course. Their last transmissions spoke of total disorientation. No compass, no land in sight, no idea of their location. Controllers on the ground were trying to guide them, but the messages came through broken and faint. The longer the confusion continued, the larger the search area became. When the Mariner was sent out, the idea was simple: get a large, long-range aircraft into the air fast, one that could cover hundreds of miles and coordinate with other rescue units. On the plotting table at the air station, officers pushed markers across the map. Some were marking the last known positions of the Avengers, others were marking the expanding arcs of possible drift. Then they marked the intended path of the Mariner, a clean, direct line, a rescue aircraft moving toward the darkening ocean. The radio operator on the Mariner gave the expected check-in as they passed the coastline. Everything was normal. The message was logged at 7:30 p.m. Controllers wrote down the time and waited for the next scheduled transmission. They expected more updates soon, but no further messages came. At around the same time, on the open ocean, the crew of a nearby tanker saw something. A massive fireball lit up the horizon, a bright flash, then darkness again. They reported the explosion to the Coast Guard, describing what looked like aviation fuel burning on the surface of the sea. The timing matched the Mariner's first leg of its search route, but no debris was ever recovered that could officially confirm the identity of what exploded. Back in the control room, the lack of communication from the Mariner began to worry the officers. The aircraft was supposed to be checking in on a steady schedule. They tried calling it, no response. They tried raising Flight 19 again, silence. The two timelines, the searchers and the searched for, were collapsing into one story, a growing void over the Atlantic. Investigators later reconstructed the chain of decisions that shaped what happened to the Mariner. The crew followed standard procedures on departure. They carried full fuel. They flew into an area where the weather was deteriorating. They had no radio issues during the initial call, and then, nothing. The most likely cause raised in official reports was a mid-air explosion, the kind the Mariner had been known for. If fuel vapor had accumulated in the hull, anything from a spark to a switch could have ignited it. The tanker's report of a large flash supported this possibility. The complete lack of wreckage supported it too. A violent explosion could have scattered debris across a wide area or vaporized large sections of the aircraft. Another detail investigators noted was that the Mariner carried extra fuel tanks in the wings. In the model launched that night, these tanks had caused problems in the past. The aircraft's history included several incidents where crews noticed fuel vapors gathering in compartments, especially when ventilation was poor. On a night flight, in humid air with electrical systems running heavily, it was a risk no one fully understood at the time. Meanwhile, the search for Flight 19 continued through the night. Multiple aircraft flew patterns across the ocean, calling out into the dark for any reply. Ships scanned the water with spotlights. Nothing appeared. By morning, both the Avengers and the Mariner were officially missing. On the map, their disappearance looked unreal. Two separate sets of tracks, one from the training flight, one from the rescue flight, both ending abruptly over water. No black box, no distress signal, no confirmed debris, just two converging voids. The investigation afterward tried to untangle the timeline minute by minute. They reconstructed the Avengers' confusion, then overlaid the Mariner's path. They looked at weather conditions, wind speeds, fuel loads, radio schedules, and aircraft history. They noted the reports of explosions, the lack of wreckage, and the known problems of the PBM design. They listed what could be explained and what could not. The chain of decisions on the Mariner's side was straightforward. Launch immediately, fly outbound, check in, begin search grid. The chain of events, however, likely spiraled in seconds, faster than anyone could send a warning. One moment the aircraft was flying normally. The next moment, the tanker crew saw a flash that lit up the sky. When these two timelines are placed side by side, the Avengers losing bearings in daylight and the Mariner vanishing minutes after sunset, the story becomes one of pure unanswered movement across the map. Two missions, two sets of radios, two sets of coordinates that faded into silence within hours. Before the end of the night, the control room marked the last entry next to the Mariner's call sign. It read only, "No further contact, presumed lost," and the final words ever heard from the search crew remained the same ones written in the radio log at 7:30 p.m. "Will stand by. The Valentich disappearance, 1978. The sun had already dropped below the horizon when the first call came in. At 7:06 p.m. on October 21st, 1978, a young pilot named Frederick Valentich radioed Melbourne Flight Service. His voice was steady but carried a faint tension, the kind that made controllers sit up a little straighter. He said there was another aircraft near him. He wanted to know if anything appeared on radar. The operator checked. Nothing. No traffic. No known aircraft in the area. When he told Valentich the sky was clear, the reply came back with a small edge of disbelief. Frederick said he could see something, long, shiny and moving fast. It passed over him at high speed. That was the start of a 6-minute timeline that has never fully been explained. Valentich was flying a Cessna 182 from Moorabbin Airport to King Island. It was a short route across Bass Strait, a stretch of water known for quick-changing weather and strong winds. The flight was not dangerous, but it wasn't simple either. Valentich was 20 years old. He had around 150 hours of flying experience, enough to be confident, not enough to be hardened. The next transmission came quickly. The object wasn't just nearby, it was playing with him. Those were his words. It approached from the east, crossed above him, then disappeared. He couldn't identify it. He asked again if any military aircraft were in the area. The answer was the same. None. On the map in the control room, the operator marked Valentich's last known position, south of Melbourne and west of Cape Otway. His altitude was normal, his speed was normal. Everything about the Cessna, on paper, was ordinary. The only thing that wasn't ordinary was the pilot's running commentary. At 7:09 p.m, his tone changed again. He said the object was now orbiting him, a circular motion, around a small Cessna over dark water. He said it had a green light. The controller asked him to confirm its shape. Valentich paused, then said he couldn't tell. It was too fast, too unusual. Then he said something that would be quoted for decades. It's not an aircraft. What followed was a minute-by-minute unravelling of calm. Valentich said the object had vanished again. He sounded confused. He was trying to maintain altitude. Then the controller asked him, "What is your altitude now?" Valentich said, 4,500, 4,000. There was a hesitation in his voice, as if he was checking his instruments and not trusting what he saw. At 7:11 p.m, he said the strange craft was coming for another pass. He reported that it was very bright. He said it came from the south this time. The operator tried to get more details, but Valentich seemed to struggle to articulate what he was seeing. He said the object appeared metallic. He said it had a shiny surface. And again, green lights. In the control room, the tension rose. Controllers tried to match his descriptions with anything in the area. Civilian traffic, military, even atmospheric reflections. Nothing fit. Base Strait looked empty. At 7:12 p.m, another problem emerged. Valentich said his engine was rough idling. He said it wasn't running right. The controller asked if he needed assistance. Valentich didn't answer the question directly. He returned to the object. He said it was still there. He said it was hovering above him. The controller pressed for position. Valentich said he was near Cape Otway. The map was updated again. A straight line, a normal route. Nothing strange, except everything was strange. At 7:13 p.m, the voice on the radio took on a strained, stretched quality. Valentich said the object was now orbiting above him. That was the last intelligible description he gave. Then came the noise, a long, metallic scraping sound. Not rhythmic, not mechanical, just a dragging, grinding tone that filled the frequency. Controllers recorded it, they replayed it. They described it later as a kind of metallic vibration. It lasted 17 seconds, and then the line went dead. No further transmissions ever came from Frederick Valentich. The timeline ended abruptly. The map stopped. The radios returned to routine traffic, but the echo of that last sound remained, carried by a silence that stretched long after the operator's final call-out to the missing Cessna. Immediately a search began. Aircraft flew patterns across Bass Strait. Ships scanned the water. The weather was calm with only light winds. Visibility was decent. Search crews expected to find something. Floating debris, an oil slick, a life jacket. But nothing appeared. Not that night, not the next day, not the next week. The ocean gave nothing back. In the aftermath, Valentich's final transmissions travelled far beyond the control room. Aviation authorities studied his flight plan. They reviewed his pilot history. They examined fuel loads, weather data, known aircraft positions, and psychological factors. The timeline raised several possibilities: spatial disorientation, misidentification of planets or stars, reflections from his own aircraft, illusions caused by darkness over water, but the transmissions remained. They were recorded live. The pattern of his words, the steadiness at first, the rising tension, the fixation on the object, the engine trouble, created a sequence that did not fit cleanly into any single explanation. Another timeline formed in parallel, the timeline of theories. Some focused on misnavigation, suggesting that Valentich may have become disoriented and entered a descending spiral over the water. Others suggested his aircraft might have suffered an engine issue, leading to a crash. Some pointed at the possibility of accidental inversion, flying upside down without realizing it, though the evidence for that was mixed. Then came the other theories, the ones that latched onto his descriptions, the orbiting, the green lights, the metallic gleam, the hovering, and especially the recorded sound at the end. These details pushed the event into the public imagination as a UFO encounter, a label that Valentich himself had indirectly encouraged by his own words. Search efforts continued for days, then weeks. The Royal Australian Air Force reviewed radar logs. Civilian vessels were contacted. Fishing boats were checked. No confirmed wreckage ever surfaced. Years later, small pieces of metal were found on beaches around Bass Strait, but none could be definitively linked to Valentich's aircraft. The Cessna 182 he flew was never recovered. Without the aircraft, there was no way to reconstruct the final seconds after the radio cut out. And so the echoes carried on, through documentaries, through aviation journals, through official reports, and through the single line spoken in the dark over Bass Strait: "It's not an aircraft." Those words, and the long metallic noise that followed, became the permanent ending of Frederick Valentich's story. Everything after that moment exists only in theories, memories, and the unbroken silence that came from the water below. BSAA Star Tiger, 1948. The last message sounded calm. It arrived just before dawn on January 30th, 1948. The crew of the British South American Airways Avro Tudor IV, known as Star Tiger, radioed their position and altitude while flying from the Azores to Bermuda. The voice was steady. The report was routine. No mention of trouble, no request for assistance. Then the transmission ended, and nothing followed it. That normal, uneventful message became the final sign of an aircraft that carried 31 people and simply vanished. The Star Tiger had left Santa Maria in the Azores the night before. It was a long over-water crossing, but not an unusual one for the airline. The aircraft was designed for long distances, and the crew was experienced in Atlantic navigation. On board were a mix of passengers, business travellers, families, and professional crew members returning home. There was nothing unusual about the passenger list, nothing extraordinary about the cargo, and nothing remarkable about the weather forecast at departure. But the route itself was known for winter turbulence. The flight would take the Tudor into areas of unpredictable winds and irregular pockets of cloud. For safety and comfort, the Star Tiger flew at a lower altitude than usual, staying under strong headwinds. Flying low made for a smoother ride, but left little room for error if weather changed. When the aircraft took off, the crew estimated their arrival in Bermuda early the next morning. They reported their progress regularly across the Atlantic. Controllers logged each fix on the chart. A straight path moving west, slightly arched along the Great Circle route. The posts on the map matched the expected timeline. There was no drift, no sudden deviation, no sign of concern. As night deepened, the winds picked up. The aircraft adjusted, heading for drift correction. They descended again to avoid turbulence. Still, nothing in the radio log suggested danger. The Star Tiger moved across the plotting board like any other overnight flight. Then came the final message. Position reported, altitude reported, all normal, no distress call, and silence. After the last transmission, controllers waited for the next check-in. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. They called the aircraft, no reply. They called again, still nothing. On the map, the line carried on toward Bermuda, but the radio stayed silent. The gap between the last known position and expected arrival lengthened. Soon it was clear the Star Tiger was overdue. The search began quickly. Bermuda dispatchers contacted other aircraft in the region. They launched planes from the island to intercept the expected route. They widened the grid into long rectangular sweeps, a standard pattern for over-water searches. As the day progressed, more aircraft joined. Ships were redirected. The ocean below was scanned for oil slicks, floating debris, or signs of an emergency landing. But there was nothing. No sighting, no wreckage, no flare, no beacon. Investigators began reconstructing the story backward from the last message. The position given placed the Star Tiger roughly 2 hours from Bermuda. Weather logs showed some turbulence but not a severe storm. Winds were strong at altitude, which explained the lower flight path. Fuel consumption records indicated the aircraft should have had enough reserves to reach Bermuda without issue. But the low altitude raised concerns. Flying at that height during night over the ocean means fewer options if visibility drops. Clouds could appear without warning. A sudden change in wind could push the aircraft off course. If the Star Tiger descended even slightly in cloud, it might never have seen the water approaching. At night, the surface of the Atlantic gives no visual cues. Pilots often described it as black glass, invisible, silent, and impossible to judge without instruments. The map of the flight showed one more risk. The curvature of the route meant that if the aircraft drifted just a little south or west, it could miss Bermuda entirely. Strong winds could push the aircraft off track, while giving the crew the impression they were still following the correct heading. If they passed the island in darkness and cloud, they might not have noticed until fuel ran low. Investigators also looked at mechanical possibilities. The Avro Tudor had experienced issues in the past with engine reliability. Its long-range configuration could be sensitive to weight distribution and fuel load. But nothing in the radio log suggested the crew was struggling with engine problems that night. They had not reported smoke, vibration, or performance loss. Everything pointed to a flight that seemed routine until the moment it vanished. The search continued for days. Each morning, the map in the operations room expanded. Search grids grew larger. Planes flew farther from the expected path. Ships covered new sectors. Each evening, the grid was updated with the day's results. Nothing found. The ocean remained blank. The lack of debris was one of the most puzzling elements. Even in catastrophic crashes, aircraft often leave life vests, papers, seat cushions, and other floating materials. The Atlantic search teams found none. Not a single confirmed piece of the Star Tiger was recovered. The search grid eventually stretched hundreds of miles across open water. Still nothing. As the investigation continued, attention returned to the last known position. The map of Vanishing pointed to a region north of the island of Flores and southeast of Bermuda. Investigators compared weather data, drift estimates, and fuel calculations. They plotted possible descent paths. They traced alternative headings the crew might have taken if they believed they were closer to Bermuda than they actually were. Every scenario ended the same way. Somewhere in the dark, the aircraft crossed a point of no return. In the aftermath, theories multiplied. Some focused on navigational error in poor visibility. Others considered mechanical failure that happened too fast for a distress call. Some pointed out the risk of icing at low altitude, which could cause loss of lift and sudden descent. Others emphasized the possibility of fuel mismanagement during turbulence. But without wreckage, there was no way to confirm any scenario. What remained was the final calm message, a routine position report that sounded like every other message sent that night. No fear, no confusion, no problem. That message became the fixed point on the map, the place where certainty ended and the ocean began. The Star Tiger continued west on paper, but in reality it disappeared into a silence that search crews, investigators, and families never overturned. A flight that had been normal in every way left behind only one trace, the last coordinates given by a crew who believed they had hours of flight left, unaware that those would be the last words anyone would ever hear from them. BSAA Star Ariel, 1949. The last message from the Star Ariel came in with absolute calm. The aircraft was flying under a cloudless sky, in perfect visibility, with smooth air stretching from horizon to horizon. The crew reported they were switching radio frequency as they moved south, leaving Bermuda's control zone and preparing to contact the next station on their route. The message was routine. It carried no urgency, no hint of trouble. Then they changed frequency, and nothing more was ever heard from them. That clear, uneventful transmission marked the beginning of an aviation mystery that mirrored the disappearance of the Star Tiger the year before, but unfolded under conditions that made the silence even harder to understand. The story splits into two timelines. One follows the Star Ariel itself on its last flight. The other follows the investigators, researchers, and modern analysts who have tried for decades to reconstruct its path using every available clue. The flight began on January 17, 1949. The Avro Tudor 4 departed Bermuda just before 9 a.m. with 7 crew members and 13 passengers. The weather was excellent. Pilots described the sky that day as unbroken blue, the kind of conditions that offered wide horizons and easy navigation. There were no storms nearby, no reports of turbulence, and no warnings affecting the flight path. Soon after takeoff, the Star Ariel climbed to 18,000 feet. Airplanes often flew high to save fuel and take advantage of smoother winds. The Tudor cruised well at that altitude, with its 4 engines performing a steady rhythm that crews trusted. Every system aboard the aircraft appeared to be functioning normally. At 9:42 a.m, the crew sent their last clear message. They reported their current position, altitude, and weather conditions. Then they stated they were changing frequency to contact the next control station along their route, which would guide them toward Jamaica. That changeover was routine. Flights did it every day. Controllers expected a call within minutes. No call ever came. On the map inside the control room, the expected path of the Star Ariel stretched south from Bermuda in a long arc. The timeline for the next expected transmission was short. Radio operators listened. They waited. They tried calling the aircraft. There was no reply. The aircraft had vanished somewhere between one frequency and the next. In the second timeline, the investigators began piecing together what could have happened in that small window of silence. The first fact standing out was the weather. It remained perfect all day. That meant no sudden storms, no icing clouds, no towering thunderheads. The low risk of unexpected weather made the disappearance even more perplexing. The second fact was the lack of any distress call. Aircraft crews were trained to send an emergency signal even if they had only seconds. Engines failing, rapid loss of altitude, structural failure, any of these situations usually produced a final transmission. But the Star Ariel said nothing. No static, no broken message, no fragment of words. That silence led investigators to consider mechanical failure so sudden and catastrophic that the crew had no time to react. The Tudor series had a mixed reliability record. Past incidents included pressurization issues and engine problems, but the aircraft had completed many successful flights as well. And on this particular day, nothing in the radio messages suggested trouble. The search began the moment officials realized the aircraft had missed its scheduled check-in. Aircraft from Bermuda and Jamaica flew coordinated patterns along the expected route. Ships in the region were notified. The weather helped the search crews. The sea was calm and visibility remained high. Conditions were almost ideal for finding debris. They found nothing. No oil slick, no floating wreckage, no life rafts, no bodies, not a single verified item from the aircraft. In the second timeline, back in the operations rooms, investigators reconstructed the grid again and again. The distance from Bermuda to Jamaica was well within the range of the Tudor. Fuel was not a factor. If the engines had failed, the aircraft should have glided long enough for a distress call. If the fuselage had depressurized, the crew should have been able to radio before descending. The absence of any message forced investigators to consider extremely fast mechanical events: mid-air breakup, sudden structural failure, or an explosion. But these possibilities also carried problems. Mid-air explosions usually leave debris scattered. Breakups often leave wide trails of floating parts, yet nothing floated. The map of Vanishing showed a thin corridor of warm ocean, calm and clear, with traffic passing through regularly. Ships crossing the area reported no unusual signs. The ocean gave no answers. As time passed, the story of the Star Ariel moved into the timeline of echoes. Years of researchers trying to understand how an aircraft could disappear in perfect weather, in broad daylight, on one of the most carefully monitored routes of the region. Some modern analysts used updated wind models and reconstructed flight paths to test new scenarios. They considered wind drift, potential mechanical failure modes, and even pilot incapacitation. They examined weight distribution, fuel management, and the structural history of the Tudor fleet. Yet each model ended with uncertainty. Others compared the case to the Star Tiger, which vanished almost exactly 1 year earlier while flying for the same airline. The similarities, same aircraft type, same airline, disappearing over the ocean without distress calls, added to speculation. But the Star Tiger had flown into poor weather. The Star Ariel had not. Some researchers suggested radio issues. If the Tudor lost its ability to transmit, the crew might have been flying blind in communication terms, unable to confirm their position or ask for help. But that scenario still would not explain the total loss of the aircraft. The echoes continued into later decades. Aviation historians revisited the case with modern forensic methods. They compared the Tudor's structure to known failure patterns from other aircraft. They ran simulations using data from more advanced engines and navigation systems. But the result remained the same, a flight that vanished without leaving a trace. The calm final words, "switching frequency now," became the fixed point in every reconstruction, a moment where everything seemed normal, a moment where nothing felt out of place, a moment that gave no clue that the aircraft was seconds from disappearing into a silence from which it never returned. The disappearance of the star Ariel left behind only that quiet final message, a flight path drawn across a blank ocean, and an open space on the map where 30 souls were lost without explanation. The kind of vanishing that still leads investigators decades later to redraw the grid, test new calculations, and listen again to the last ordinary words spoken on a frequency that never heard them again. The lost DC-3 from San Juan, 1948. The last message was confident, almost casual. The crew of the DC-3 reported they were about 50 miles south of Miami and expected to be over the city in 20 minutes. There was no trace of stress in their voices, no mention of unusual weather, no mechanical trouble, just a routine position update nearing the end of a long night flight. Then the transmission faded, and the aircraft never arrived. It was December 28, 1948, when the Douglas DC-3 lifted off from San Juan, Puerto Rico, headed for Miami with passengers and crew aboard. The flight had already been delayed by several hours. The aircraft had taken on extra fuel. There had been last-minute adjustments, small issues, and maintenance checks. But none of those, on their own, seemed serious enough to endanger the journey across the Caribbean and the Florida Straits. The night was clear. The moonlight reflected off calm sections of water. Radio communication with the DC-3 remained steady through the first part of the flight. They made scheduled check-ins as they passed checkpoints along their route. Everything suggested a normal crossing. Then, during the early morning hours, the flight crew made their final report, their position, their speed, their expected arrival time. "We'll be over Miami in 20 minutes. Those were their last known words. From here, the timeline switches to the investigation, one built on maintenance records, weather reports, witness statements, and the fuel and load charts reconstructed after the disappearance. Together, they form a chain of decisions that may have played a quiet role in the final outcome. The DC-3 was a sturdy aircraft. It had served during the war, then carried passengers in peacetime. But sturdy didn't mean flawless. Hours before departure from San Juan, mechanics were dealing with electrical problems. Batteries had been changed, then recharged, then tested again. One of the issues involved radio power. There were concerns about the reliability of the system that kept the aircraft's electrical equipment running during the long flight. The crew was aware of this and had signed off on its status before takeoff. Another detail in the chain concerned weight. The DC-3 carried a significant load that night: passengers, luggage, mail, and fuel. Some later analysis suggested the aircraft may have been close to its upper limits. Overloading wasn't necessarily dangerous on its own, but in poor weather or with electrical issues, it could add strain to an aircraft climbing or descending. Weather was the next piece of the chain. Although reports said the skies were mostly clear, there were scattered clouds and patches of turbulence over the Florida Straits. Nothing severe enough to halt flights, but conditions that called for careful navigation. Night flying over water comes with a well-known challenge. Darkness above and darkness below can merge into one, making the horizon hard to spot. Pilots rely heavily on instruments. If instruments begin to fail, even slightly, the situation becomes dangerous very quickly. Investigators later learned that shortly before the final message, radio operators in Miami attempted to reach the DC-3 and got no response. That didn't immediately raise alarms. Sometimes aircraft flying low or at distance slipped into dead zones. But as minutes passed, the lack of communication suggested a real problem. Ground controllers tried again, and again. No reply. The map of the DC-3's expected path showed a narrow corridor leading straight to Miami. The timing of their last message placed them close to the Florida coast. Search planes were launched at first light. Ships were redirected. The search began with a sense of urgency. The final transmission had sounded so normal that rescue teams hoped for a forced landing or a ditching close to land. Within hours, searchers found debris floating in the water off Miami: seat cushions, small pieces of wood, fragments of interior structure. These items suggested the aircraft had struck the surface of the water, but none of the large components, the fuselage, wings, engines, were ever found. No oil slick that could be traced to the DC-3 appeared. No bodies were recovered. The main wreck remained missing. The chain of decisions now looked different. The aircraft had likely suffered a sudden failure that gave the crew no time to send a distress call. The electrical problems that had delayed takeoff may have returned. If power to the radios failed first, the crew might not have been able to report the issue. If the cockpit lighting dimmed or failed, instrument reading would have become harder. If navigation equipment dropped offline, the pilots might have misread their altitude or heading. Another theory noted that the DC-3 might have flown lower than estimated. Over water at night, with darkness blending sea and sky, spatial disorientation could lead to controlled flight into the ocean. The plane could descend slowly with pilots unaware of their height until impact. The debris, which was small, supported the idea of a severe, immediate collision with water. Some analysts proposed that the aircraft, heavy with fuel, might have stalled if its speed dropped even slightly. A stall over water, especially at night, is often unrecoverable. In such a scenario, there is no time to transmit a distress call. As the investigation continued, every element in the chain was reviewed. The delayed departure, the battery tests, the electrical warnings, the added fuel, the weather, the weight. Each piece alone might not have caused disaster. Together they painted a picture of an aircraft flying with thin margins. Yet despite all this, nothing explained the lack of wreckage. A crash so close to the coast, in water searched so thoroughly, should have left more behind. Search crews covered hundreds of miles. They scanned the shorelines, they tracked drift patterns, but the ocean remained silent. The last message, "We'll be over Miami in 20 minutes, stayed fixed on the timeline as a contrast to what followed. It was a confident prediction from a crew who believed the hardest part of their flight was behind them. They were close to home. They were minutes from land. The aircraft never appeared. Years later, researchers revisited the charts, recalculated wind drift, and recreated possible descent paths. They found no definitive explanation. The DC-3 case remains one of the most baffling disappearances in the region, not because of storms or strange circumstances, but because everything seemed so ordinary right up until the moment the radio went silent. The confident voice over the radio, the calm estimate of arrival, and the lack of any warning became the last echoes of a flight that left behind only scattered debris and one of the most enduring questions in aviation history: how an aircraft so close to shore could disappear completely between a final routine message and the moment it was expected to break through the clouds above Miami. Northwest Flight 2501 over Lake Michigan, 1950. The last significant message from Northwest Flight 2501 came at 11:51 p.m. on June 23, 1950. The pilot requested permission to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet. His voice was controlled, but the reason he gave was clear: severe turbulence and lightning. He wanted to get beneath the worst of the storm. Air traffic control denied the request. Other aircraft were flying below him. The skies over Lake Michigan were crowded, stormy and unstable. Just minutes later, radio contact ended, and the DC-4 vanished. The story of Flight 2501 is a chain of decisions, some made by the crew, some by controllers, and some by the weather itself, interlocked across a map of violent storm cells moving over the lake that night. The aircraft departed New York earlier that evening, bound for Seattle with a planned stop in Minneapolis. It carried 58 people, passengers, crew, and a full load of cargo. The DC-4 was a well-established four-engine airliner, reliable and widely used. It wasn't known for structural weakness. It had crossed storm systems before. Nothing about its history pointed to a hidden flaw waiting to break. But the weather across the Midwest on June 23rd was a different challenge. Storm lines stretched from the plains to the Great Lakes, with thunderheads rising tens of thousands of feet into the night. Pilots reported lightning flashes that lit up entire cloud walls. Turbulence was strong enough to throw loose items around cabins. Controllers were rerouting many flights around the worst cells. That's how Flight 2501 ended up over Lake Michigan. The northern route toward Minneapolis passed into the path of heavy storms. The aircraft was diverted west to approach the lake from a safer angle, but storms shifted, new ones formed. By the time the DC-4 reached the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, the skies were no longer safer there either. On the map in the control center, the storm cells moved like dark stains drifting across the lake. They pulsed, grew, and scattered. Controllers tried to keep aircraft at different altitudes to avoid collisions while still helping pilots escape turbulence. Flight 2501 was assigned 3,500 feet, a low altitude for night flight, but a necessary one for traffic spacing. At around 11:30 p.m, turbulence worsened. The crew reported it. The lightning around them intensified. Then came the request to descend to 2,500 feet. The request was reasonable, pilots often dipped below turbulent layers at night, but the controller denied it. Other flights were occupying that level. Moving everything around in the middle of a storm could create more danger. That denial became a critical moment in the chain. Whether the descent would have helped or changed anything remains unknown. But it locked the DC-4 into an altitude that placed it directly inside the storm's unstable band. The map shows the next key moment at 11:51 p.m. That was when the crew repeated the turbulence report and renewed their request. Again, they were denied. After that message, silence. The DC-4 did not respond to later calls. No distress signal was ever recorded. The aircraft disappeared from all communication, somewhere over the black water of Lake Michigan, with storms swirling above and below it. When the aircraft failed to land in Minneapolis, an immediate search began. At dawn, the lake was covered with choppy waves and streaked with the remnants of the storm. Search planes flew low, looking for any sign of floating debris. Coast Guard vessels scanned the surface. Civilian boats joined them. The first finds were small, very small, fragments of the DC-4's interior insulation, seats, small pieces of metal, clothing. Later, remains of some passengers washed ashore near Benton Harbor and South Haven. But no large parts of the aircraft, no wings, no engines, no fuselage, were ever recovered. The map of Vanishing narrowed to a rough zone southeast of Milwaukee and east of Chicago. The problem was depth. Much of Lake Michigan in that area reaches several hundred feet deep. With 1950 technology, searching beneath the surface was limited. Side-scan sonar did not exist yet. Submersible vehicles were rare and primitive. The lakebed remained a dark, unreachable place. As investigators reconstructed the chain of decisions, they focused on the weather first. The storm over the lake had extreme updrafts and downdrafts. Some aircraft reported sudden altitude drops of several hundred feet. Lightning had been constant. Turbulence had been among the worst pilots reported that night. A DC-4 flying at 3,500 feet in that environment had very little safety margin. A downward burst of wind or a sudden stall could push the aircraft toward the surface of the lake before the crew could recover. If the aircraft hit the water at high speed, it could break apart instantly, scattering debris widely and sinking the main structure in seconds. Another factor was the aircraft's fuel load and weight. The DC-4 was flying heavy after its cross-country departure. The combination of low altitude, storm turbulence, and heavy weight increased the stress on its structure. Investigators considered the possibility that an extreme gust caused the wings or tail to fail. Turbulence that night was powerful enough to damage aircraft with far stronger structures than a 1950s airliner. Then there was the issue of air traffic congestion. Controllers could not simply let the DC-4 descend because that layer already held other flights trying to escape the storm. Moving one plane required shifting several others. Time was tight. Radios were busy. Weather was worsening. Every piece of the chain added to the risk but did not fully explain the total disappearance. The aftermath timeline stretched for years. Families sought answers. Search expeditions tried new techniques. Sonar surveys in later decades scanned parts of the lakebed. None found the wreck. Every attempt returned the same conclusion. The aircraft lies somewhere on the bottom of Lake Michigan, scattered or buried under shifting sediment. Researchers using modern storm modelling later confirmed that the DC-4 was likely inside one of the most violent storm cells of the night. At the moment its radio went silent. The spot lines on the map overlay almost perfectly, but modelling cannot say whether the aircraft broke apart in the air, struck the lake intact, or suffered a sudden mechanical failure. What remains is the last request from the pilot. Request descent to 2,500 feet. Denied, logged, and followed by silence. The chain of decisions, the violent weather patterns mapped across the lake, and the scattering of debris along the shoreline all point to a sudden, catastrophic event. But without the main wreck, the exact cause remains out of reach, somewhere beneath the waves, on a lake bed no one has yet been able to fully search. The 1950 C-54D disappearance over the Yukon. The last radio message from the C-54 Skymaster came in with the same monotony as every other check-in that night. It was January 26, 1950. The 4-engine transport had been airborne for about 2 hours on its route from Alaska to Montana. The crew reported their position, their speed, their altitude, nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at trouble. The transmission logged the aircraft near Snag, Yukon. And then the radio fell silent. From that point forward, 2 timelines began to unfold. One belonged to the Skymaster itself, flying deeper into the darkness above northern Canada. The other belonged to the search teams, aircrews, soldiers and trackers, who spent weeks trying to cover a region so vast and remote that even modern aircraft struggled to navigate it. The C-54D that night carried 44 people, service members heading south, crew, and passengers riding along the military transport network. The Skymaster was a proven aircraft, used heavily in the Berlin airlift, and known for its range, reliability, and carrying capacity. Its flight from Anchorage to Great Falls should have been an uneventful hop across the Yukon Plateau. Weather was cold as expected in January, but not extreme. Winds were manageable, visibility was decent. The route was long but routine. For the first hours of flight, radio logs show nothing out of place. At roughly the 2-hour mark, the crew gave their final position report. They were near Snag, a remote settlement surrounded by endless forest, rivers, and mountain valleys. The exact time was logged, the message was clear, and there was no indication that the flight was experiencing any kind of emergency. Back in the control centres, the timeline simply ticked forward. The next scheduled check-in time approached. Controllers expected another routine message. It never came. The minutes stretched on. More calls were made to the aircraft. Nothing. Uncertainty began to build. But uncertainty was common in northern flights. Radio reception over the Yukon often dropped in and out. Aircraft disappeared from signal range briefly only to return later. At first, no one panicked. Still, the controller marked the silence on the board, a note in red, a question mark beside the aircraft's last known position. The second timeline now began to accelerate. As the flight continued overdue, the growing gap triggered the first alerts. Attempts to reach the Skymaster from multiple stations failed. Weather reports were checked to see if a storm had formed. None had. Other aircraft in the region were contacted. None had seen anything. Ground observers were called. No one had heard an engine or seen a light crossing the sky. By the time the aircraft missed its next major check-in entirely, the situation shifted from routine delay to probable emergency. Search orders were issued. The first wave of search planes lifted off at dawn. They flew toward the last known coordinates, a wide stretch of rugged northern wilderness where mountains met valleys and deep forests stretched across the Yukon. The Skymaster had been flying at night at altitude, in a region with few landmarks and almost no ground lighting. If the aircraft had gone down, it could have disappeared into terrain that swallowed wreckage whole. The search area expanded hour by hour. New sectors were assigned. Maps were pinned to walls, showing grids that grew larger each day. The cold air made search flights risky, but crews continued. More aircraft joined, American, Canadian, military and civilian. Each flight swept over tree lines and frozen lakes, searching for the faintest sign of metal, smoke or broken snow. Nothing. The timeline on the search board grew into days, then into weeks. This was becoming one of the largest aerial searches in North American history. At its peak, over 70 aircraft participated, flying thousands of hours. Ground teams pushed through deep snow with the dogs and sleds, sometimes covering only small distances each day. The terrain, steep ridges, frozen riverbeds, heavy forest, made even small searches incredibly difficult. In the other timeline, the one belonging to the vanished aircraft, the possibilities multiplied. Investigators reviewed the chain of decisions made before and during the flight. Was the aircraft carrying too much weight? Its load was within standard limits. Were there known mechanical issues with that particular Skymaster? None documented before departure. Did weather change suddenly after the last contact? Records showed no major storm in the area. Could icing have caused a stall? Possible, but no distress call was received. Could the crew have become disoriented, flying into rising terrain at night? Also possible, given the mountainous region, but none of these theories explained the full silence. Even in rapid emergencies, most crew send at least one broken radio call, a phrase, a code, a single word. But there was nothing from Flight 2501 after the position report. Total silence. The search continued. Planes flew so many overlapping grids that some pilots said they could almost recite the terrain by memory. Ground crews followed river valleys looking for unnatural snow patterns or smoke stains. Local hunters were questioned. Remote cabins were visited. Every possible explanation was tested. The maps filled with coloured pencil, red for completed grids, blue for probable drift paths, yellow for mountainous sectors too dangerous to search by air. As the days passed, the unsearched regions grew smaller, but the results stayed the same. No wreckage, no debris, no bodies, not even a fuel stain on the snow. Silence remained the only constant. In later years, analysts using more advanced tools revisited the case. They compared the flight path to digital elevation models. They examined prevailing winds and drift. They tested whether a controlled flight into terrain might have sent the aircraft into a valley that later avalanches buried. Some suggested that deep lakes in the region, cold, isolated and rarely surveyed, might hide the wreck. The Yukon has bodies of water so deep that even today they have never been scanned by sonar. Despite these theories, the aircraft has never been located. The last confirmed moment in its timeline remains the routine message 2 hours into the flight. A short report, a calm voice, a simple confirmation of position. Then the long northern night took the rest of the story, and the maps, filled with thousands of flight hours of searching, remained blank in the one sector where 44 people vanished without a trace. Pan Am Flight 7, Romance of the Skies, 1957. The final message from Pan American World Airways Flight 7 came hours into its long trans-Pacific crossing. It was a simple position report. The plane was on course, cruising normally, and the crew ended with the familiar summary used on thousands of flights. All well on board. There was no hint of worry in the captain's voice, no indication of trouble, no sign that anything on the aircraft needed attention. Hours later, the romance of the skies was gone. The aircraft was a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, one of the most advanced long-range airliners of its time. It carried crew and passengers from San Francisco toward Honolulu on a route Pan Am had flown countless times. On board were business travellers, families, servicemen and crew members who knew the Pacific run by heart. The flight plan was clear, weather stable, and the skies mostly open. Once airborne, everything appeared normal. The Stratocruiser climbed smoothly, levelled off, and began the long sweep westward. Radio communication remained steady. The flight crew checked in at scheduled intervals. Fuel burn was normal, engine performance logged evenly across all 4 Pratt & Whitney radial engines. Then came the routine position message, the one that ended with all well on board. After that, no further transmissions came from the aircraft. No distress call, no emergency signal, no fragments of broken radio messages. The silence was complete. From this moment onward, the chapter shifts into the chain of decisions and technical details that investigators pieced together afterward, from wreckage, autopsies and maintenance records. Hours after the final message, when the Stratocruiser should have been making contact with Honolulu, the absence of communication raised alarms. Efforts to reach the aircraft failed. The expected radar echo never reappeared. No navigation beacon signal approached the island. Search orders were issued. The next day, debris was spotted, floating on the surface of the Pacific. Life jackets, seat cushions, luggage. And then, more grimly, bodies. The location of the debris was far west of the aircraft's projected path. This was the first major clue. Something catastrophic had happened with no time for the crew to respond or correct course. Recoveries over the following days brought in more debris and remains. Even though the main wreck sank, what floated was enough to offer partial insight, yet also enough to deepen the mystery. Investigators began with maintenance history. The Stratocruiser had a known pattern of mechanical concerns centered around its engines. The Boeing 377 was built on a modified B-29 bomber framework, and its engines were powerful but temperamental. Several earlier Stratocruisers had suffered engine overheating, vibration problems, or gear train failures. These issues didn't guarantee disaster, but they created risk. On Flight 7, one engine in particular, engine number 3, had drawn attention in recent months. Records showed it had exhibited vibration during previous flights. Repairs had been made, but the logs revealed recurring notes from mechanics and flight crews. The engine passed inspections, but lingering doubts remained. Another detail: the aircraft was carrying a large fuel load for the long ocean crossing. Stratocruisers stored fuel in multiple tanks along the wings. If fuel leaked or fumes built up, the risk of fire or explosion increased. There were past cases of fuel-air mixtures igniting in enclosed sections of other 377s, though such events were rare. Next came the autopsy evidence. When bodies were recovered, examiners noted high levels of carbon monoxide in the bloodstream of several victims. That was significant. Carbon monoxide typically appears when passengers inhale smoke or fumes. It can result from an onboard fire, an engine leaking exhaust into the pressurization system, or a cabin filled with combusted material after a rapid failure. Some investigators believed carbon monoxide levels pointed toward engine trouble, specifically an exhaust leak feeding into the cabin ventilation. If the crew became impaired, their ability to control the aircraft would have dropped sharply. But this theory had a problem. The amount of carbon monoxide suggested a sudden heavy exposure, not a slow leak. Another clue came from the condition of the passenger remains. Some showed signs consistent with explosive decompression, indicators of a sudden, violent breakup of the aircraft at high altitude. But the evidence was not conclusive. Much of the wreckage lay on the seafloor, unreachable. What floated was fragmented and incomplete. Investigators then reviewed the chain of decisions made before the crash. Weather reports showed light winds and calm skies, nothing severe enough to break up an aircraft. The captain had decades of experience. The crew was trained for emergencies. There was no sign of navigational error. Attention turned back to mechanical failure. One scenario suggested engine number 3 may have suffered a catastrophic failure, throwing a propeller blade or collapsing internal components. If a blade tore free at cruising speed, it could slice into the fuselage, sever control systems, rupture fuel tanks, or destabilize the aircraft instantly. Another theory proposed an onboard fire. A fuel leak ignited by engine heat could weaken the wing structure or fill the cabin with fumes in seconds. Carbon monoxide would appear exactly as the autopsies showed. A fire-damaged wing could break under flight load, sending the aircraft into a fatal descent. There was also a theory, small but persistent, of sabotage. A few unusual details, passenger backgrounds, insurance policies, and unexplained material found on some wreckage, fueled speculation. But no conclusive evidence of a bomb or intentional harm was ever established. Investigators kept sabotage on the list of possibilities but could not prove it. The final technical hypothesis was explosive decompression. If a structural weakness had been forming in the aircraft's fuselage, perhaps a hidden crack or corroded joint, it could have ruptured suddenly at altitude. This would explain the abrupt loss of control and the wide debris field. But again, the main wreck was never recovered, leaving no structural piece to analyze. The chain of decisions made by the crew offered no clear warning sign. Nothing in the radio logs showed rising concern. Nothing suggested they were aware of any system behaving strangely. Their last words, "all well on board," were delivered with the confidence of a routine ocean crossing. In the end, every possibility remained open. Fire, explosion, engine failure, structural failure, sabotage. A mixture of events happening too quickly for the crew to reach the radio. But the one fixed point on the timeline is that final calm message, followed by hours of silence and then scattered debris drifting in sunlit water. An aircraft that departed confidently into the Pacific, with an experienced crew and good weather, left behind only fragments, floating evidence of a catastrophic event that unfolded without warning, without a call for help, and without a clear explanation that investigators could confirm. All Well on Board became the last echo of a flight whose final moments remain hidden beneath the waves. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, 1962. The last message from Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 came in the middle of a calm Pacific night. The crew delivered a routine position report. No engine trouble, no weather issues, nothing that needed attention. The sky around them was clear, visibility good, and their aircraft, a Lockheed Super Constellation, was flying as planned toward the Philippines. The message ended. It was logged. Then silence. No distress call, no fragments of broken words, no indication that anything had gone wrong. From that moment, two timelines began to unfold. One followed the chartered military transport as it slipped into the void of the Western Pacific. The other followed the search teams and the families who would wait for answers that never came. Flight 739 was carrying over 90 US military personnel, soldiers heading to Vietnam for advisory missions. Others on board were support crews, flight staff, and civilians. The mission itself was routine for the Cold War era. Flying Tiger Line often moved troops, equipment, and personnel across the Pacific. The airline had experience with long over-water flights, and the Super Constellation, with its triple tail and 4 engines, had become a workhorse for military transport. The aircraft left Guam late in the evening of March 15, 1962. Weather reports along the route were encouraging. Winds were moderate, skies were mostly clear. Other flights in the region reported smooth conditions. Nothing on the flight log suggested danger. Hours into the flight, the crew radioed their position. Altitude steady, speed normal, weather fine. It was the kind of report that flight controllers heard dozens of times a day. A hand wrote the details on the dispatch chart, drawing a clean line across the map toward the aircraft's next waypoint. That line was never extended again. The second timeline begins in the control rooms, where the expected next check-in time passed without a call. At first, it caused no alarm. Flights occasionally missed a scheduled radio point. Equipment could drop out temporarily. Atmospheric conditions sometimes bent radio waves or made frequencies unstable. Controllers tried contacting the aircraft again. Nothing came back. More time passed. The silence grew heavier. When Flight 739 missed its next mandatory position report, the tension shifted. This wasn't a minor delay anymore. This was a potential emergency. Controllers contacted nearby flights to ask if any aircraft could establish communications. None heard anything. They contacted Guam again. Still nothing. The signals remained dead. By now, flight officers knew they had a missing aircraft. As minutes turned into hours, the US military launched one of the most extensive air-sea searches in Pacific history. Naval ships changed course. Patrol aircraft scrambled. Helicopters lifted off from carriers. The search zone expanded rapidly. At first, it focused around the coordinates of the last report, then it widened. North, south, west, east, covering thousands of square miles of open ocean. The crew searched for oil slicks, life rafts, seat cushions, metallic fragments, anything. They found nothing. The Super Constellation had disappeared so completely that some search pilots began doubting whether the recorded position report had even been real. But the log was clear. The message had been received. The aircraft had been where it said it was. And then it was gone. Meanwhile, investigators began reconstructing the chain of events before the disappearance. They reviewed maintenance logs. The aircraft had been inspected before departure. No major deficiencies were documented. The engines on the Super Constellation could be temperamental, but nothing in the records suggested a looming failure. The crew was experienced with thousands of combined hours over the Pacific. Investigators also reviewed cargo and manifest records. The flight carried military personnel, standard gear, and their personal equipment. No hazardous cargo was listed. With no distress call, one scenario considered was sudden catastrophic failure. A structural break, an onboard explosion, a mid-air breakup. Any of these could explain the total silence and the absence of floating wreckage. But if an explosion had occurred, debris would normally be found. Yet the ocean remained empty. Another line of analysis focused on fuel. A long ocean flight required constant monitoring, but the flight had not reported any irregular consumption. They were well within range for their destination. Fuel exhaustion was ruled out. As the search continued, a civilian tanker reported seeing a bright flash in the distance around the time Flight 739 disappeared. High in the sky, too bright to be lightning, but the tanker was so far away that investigators could not confirm whether the flash was related or just a coincidence. The ocean gives false signals easily. Reflections, flares, distant storms. After days of searching, the maps in the operations rooms were covered with colours. Red grids for primary sweeps, blue grids for secondary sweeps, yellow zones where weather had slowed the search. Aircraft flew hundreds of hours, overlapping paths so often that crews could memorise sections of the ocean below. Still nothing. In the other timeline, the families of the passengers waited on the mainland. They had been told the weather was good, the aircraft reliable. Their loved ones were on a simple hop between islands. Many could not understand how a plane carrying so many people could simply disappear without leaving even a trace on the surface of the water. In following decades, the frustration grew deeper. Without wreckage, the sequence of events could never be reconstructed. No cockpit voice recorder existed on that model. No flight data recorder. No automatic beacons. No floating emergency locator. All anyone had was the last calm message, the one that sounded like every other position report given that night. The voice on the radio was steady, the words ordinary. There were no warnings, no tension, no indication that the aircraft was seconds or minutes away from entering one of the Pacific's most enduring mysteries. When the official report was released, its conclusion carried the same emptiness as the ocean where the search took place. Cause unknown. No evidence of weather issues. No evidence of mechanical failure. No evidence of sabotage. No evidence of anything at all. The disappearance became a quiet Cold War tragedy. Families continued to seek answers while the Pacific held its silence. Decades later, new analyses using satellite drift models, ocean current simulations, and modern radar data still produced no breakthrough. The ocean beneath the last reported position remains some of the deepest water on Earth, with trenches and ridges that make wreckage almost impossible to locate without precise coordinates. The echoes of Flight 739 are carried not by debris or recordings, but by one routine line in a radio log, the last sign of more than 100 people aboard a superconstellation that flew into a night sky and left nothing behind except questions. Position report received! Then silence. Marine Sulfur Queen, 1963. Her last position report placed her south of Key West. Nothing unusual, nothing stressed. The Marine Sulfur Queen checked in with a routine message on February 4th, 1963, while moving north along the Florida Straits. The weather was workable, seas unsettled but not hostile, and the 40-man crew had no problems to report. The ship steamed forward at a steady pace, carrying more than 15,000 tons of molten sulfur. Then the radio went silent. When she failed to arrive in Norfolk, the silence turned to alarm. The tanker had vanished somewhere between Key West and Cape Hatteras, leaving behind only scattered debris spread across the ocean. What followed was an investigation built on a chain of decisions made long before the ship cleared the Florida coast. Decisions involving cargo design, structural changes, and the risks of carrying molten sulfur inside a converted tanker hull. The Marine Sulfur Queen had once been a T-2 tanker, one of the mass-produced vessels of World War II. After the war, she was modified to carry molten sulfur heated to high temperatures inside massive insulated tanks. The conversion was functional, but it altered the structural balance of the ship. Heavy cargo sat high and off-center. Steel bulkheads were removed or reshaped. The original hull, already aging, now carried a cargo it had never been built to handle. Engineers noted these factors during various inspections. They flagged corrosion on structural beams. They listed cracked supports. They warned that the ship's central framing, especially around the cargo tanks, was weakened. But the vessel passed its certifications. Her operators believed she was safe to sail. That decision became the first major link in the chain. When the Marine Sulfur Queen left Beaumont, Texas, and crossed into the Gulf of Mexico, she carried a cargo that required constant heating. Molten sulfur solidifies as it cools. The tanker used a network of pipes to pump steam around the tanks, keeping the material at extreme temperatures. Leaks in these heating lines had occurred before. Some had been repaired, others had been patched repeatedly. The conversion placed enormous thermal strain on the hull. Still, the ship set off on schedule, heading toward Florida and then up the east coast. The second link involved weather. The forecast showed moderate to rough conditions along her route, but nothing dramatic enough to stop her. Winter storms often rolled across the Florida Straits. The crew was used to pitching seas and strong winds. But even moderate seas can become dangerous for a ship with structural vulnerabilities. At some point on February 3rd or early February 4th, the Marine Sulfur Queen encountered unsettled weather south of Key West. Her last routine message placed her precisely in that area. She reported her coordinates. No distress, no mention of trouble. Then the radio went quiet. The map of Vanishing begins there, a single point marked on the chart, then nothing beyond it. When she failed to check in further along the route and then missed her expected arrival in Norfolk, the Coast Guard launched a full search. Aircraft flew long tracks along the Florida coast, then farther out toward the Gulf Stream. Navy vessels joined the effort. Merchant ships scanned the sea. The first discoveries came from the water's surface: a life jacket, a few pieces of wood, some fragments of cork, a nameplate with part of the ship's identifier. But all of it was small, scattered, and light enough to drift. No large sections of the vessel were ever found. No lifeboats, no bodies, no major steel structure. That pattern suggested a sudden, catastrophic breakup. The Coast Guard board convened afterward examined everything: logs, maintenance records, repair histories, crew accounts from previous voyages. They discovered a troubling picture. The tanker's hull had shown signs of cracking in the past. Some repairs had been temporary. The added stress of the sulfur tanks, combined with thermal expansion from heat systems running non-stop, had weakened key structural points. Investigators noted that a fracture along the central spine could split the hull in two. Another hazard involved sulfur itself. When molten sulfur meets small amounts of moisture or certain contaminants, it can create dangerous gases. If those gases reached an ignition source, they could cause an explosion. Investigators considered this, but the debris field showed no certain signs of fire. The chain of decisions widened. Why had the ship been approved to sail with known structural concerns? Why had repeated repair recommendations been delayed? Why had a vessel carrying intense heat along an aging frame not been reinforced more thoroughly? But none of these questions produced a definitive answer. The board listed multiple contributing factors, but could not identify a single cause. On the map, the search grids filled the waters from the Florida Straits to the Carolinas. The ocean currents in that region run strong along the Gulf Stream, carrying debris far from its origin. A piece found near Cape Hatteras might have started near Key West. That complexity made the search far more difficult. Aircraft crews marked their sweeps in tight lines. Ship crews scanned for anything that floated. Days passed, then weeks. The grid expanded until the search area became too wide to continue effectively. In the end, the search found only items that could float, the smallest parts of a ship that had been almost entirely consumed by the sea. In the decades that followed, naval architects and maritime historians revisited the case repeatedly. Some believed the hull suffered a sudden structural failure in heavy seas, tearing the ship apart before the crew could send a single distress call. Others argued that molten sulfur leaks or gas buildup might have caused an explosion. Still others suggested that the heating pipes running through the ship's interior had weakened support beams until they snapped under stress. But all analyses returned to the same central mystery. The ship vanished with no warning, leaving behind only debris so minor that it gave almost no clues about how the vessel had failed. The last clear point on the map remains that routine message south of Key West, coordinates delivered calmly, with no hint that the tanker was minutes or hours away from its final moment. After that, the line on the chart dissolves into blank sea, and the disappearance of the marine Sulfur Queen stands as one of the most troubling maritime cases of its era. Not because of strange weather or unusual radio messages, but because a large ship carrying a full crew and thousands of tons of cargo left behind only fragments too small to explain how 40 lives were lost in a single, silent event. The Argentine Cadets Flight, TC-48, 1965. The first alarming message came less than an hour after takeoff. The Argentine Air Force C-54, designated TC-48, had departed Panama's Howard Air Base carrying cadets, officers and crew on a training tour across Central America. The flight was supposed to be short, just a hop toward El Salvador before continuing the regional itinerary. But around the 30-minute mark, the voice of the pilot broke through the radio waves with a message far from routine. Engine 3 was on fire, Engine 4 had failed, they were diverting. Those words marked the beginning of a real-time countdown in the cockpit, one that would last only minutes and leave investigators arguing for decades whether the aircraft fell into the sea or crashed into the mountains of Costa Rica. TC-48 was a Douglas C-54 Skymaster, a transport used widely by many air forces. Reliable, long-ranged, sturdy. But the aircraft flying that day was old. It had taken part in numerous missions, many of them flown under harsh conditions. Maintenance logs from previous months had noted engine issues, electrical quirks, and persistent wear in several components. Nothing in the records specifically grounded it, but the aircraft was far from pristine. On the morning of November 3rd, the Skymaster took off in humid tropical air. It climbed to cruising altitude over the Gulf of Panama. Weather forecasts showed pockets of instability but nothing extreme. The skies ahead toward Costa Rica were a typical mix of cloud and scattered showers, conditions the crew had handled many times. But about half an hour into the flight, heat, vibration and mechanical strain converged. The captain radioed the emergency. Engine number 3 was on fire. Engine number 4 had failed completely. Losing one engine on a 4-engine aircraft was manageable. Losing 2, especially 2 on the same wing, was critical. The aircraft's lift and control on that side would be severely compromised. Keeping altitude would become a struggle. In the cockpit, the countdown had begun. Identify the fire source, shut fuel valves, feather propellers, dump power to stabilize the aircraft. But each action took seconds the crew did not have. The message to air traffic control was urgent but controlled. The captain said they were diverting toward Costa Rica, trying to reach the nearest available runway. That decision was logical. Returning to Panama meant flying farther with a burning engine. Continuing toward El Salvador was impossible. Costa Rica offered airfields closer to their current position, if they could hold altitude long enough to reach land. Controllers acknowledged. They prepared for an emergency landing. But they never heard another clear message from TC-48. Time passed. Calls went out, no reply. More calls, nothing. The C-54 losing 2 right-side engines would begin drifting and descending. Even if the crew fought hard with rudder and aileron, the aircraft would have been slipping sideways, bleeding altitude, and suffering from asymmetric thrust. If the fire spread, structural components near the wing root could weaken. A catastrophic break was possible. The crew knew that, and yet they pressed toward Costa Rica, trying to reach mountains they could not see through the cloud. From here, the other timeline begins, the growing urgency of search crews. When the aircraft failed to land in Costa Rica, dispatchers alerted authorities across Central America. Search planes launched from Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and even the United States. Ships were deployed along the coastline. The entire region became a search grid on military maps. Initially, attention focused on the sea. The last known heading suggested the Skymaster might have fallen into the Gulf of Panama or the Pacific. Ocean currents were studied. Drift models were run. Aircraft flew low over waves looking for oil slicks, floating debris, or life rafts. But the ocean remained blank. Then attention shifted inland, into the mountains. The terrain between Panama and Costa Rica is brutal. Steep ridges, dense jungle, deep ravines, and cloud cover that clings to the slopes for days at a time. If the aircraft descended low in an attempt to glide towards land, it could have collided with terrain hidden by cloud buildup. Many pilots described the jungle canopy as a perfect absorber, capable of swallowing metal and sound completely. Search teams combed the mountains in groups, helicopters hovered over valleys, soldiers trekked through dense vegetation, indigenous communities were consulted, but no wreckage appeared. Not a wing, not a fuselage panel, not a body. Nothing. Years later, scattered reports emerged of metallic fragments found in remote forests. Some expeditions claimed to find scrap consistent with aircraft aluminum. Others reported objects they believed belonged to TC-48's interior, but none of these findings were confirmed. No official recovery ever took place. No serial numbered part was located. Meanwhile, the technical investigation reconstructed the chain of decisions in the cockpit. They examined prior maintenance entries, engine misfires, temperature warnings, and past fire risks. They analysed the C-54's behaviour under asymmetric thrust. They considered fuel load and weight at the moment of failure. All of it pointed to the same grim conclusion. After losing engines 3 and 4, the aircraft had only minutes before becoming uncontrollable. Investigators also noted the possibility of electrical failure. If wiring near the burning engine was damaged, radios could have lost power before the pilots issued a full mayday. That would explain the lack of further messages. The crew may have been battling the aircraft in silence, unable to respond to repeated radio calls. Another debated issue was altitude. The Skymaster might have tried to stay low to avoid worsening the fire. But flying low over cloud-covered mountains is deadly. With limited visibility, even a small drift could push the aircraft into rising terrain. Arguments persisted for decades. Did TC-48 break apart over the sea? Did it strike a mountainside hidden by mist? Did the fire destroy critical control surfaces mid-flight? Each scenario fit pieces of the evidence. None fit all of it, and so the disappearance remained suspended between two vast search zones, one sea, one jungle. For the families of the 68 people aboard, the silence that followed the final radio call became the enduring wound. They had a single message: Engine 3 on fire, Engine 4 failed, diverting, and nothing else. No confirmed wreck site, no recovery, no closure. The last certainty lies in that moment inside the cockpit, an aircraft burning on one side, its crew fighting with every control and checklist they had, trying to reach land before the countdown ran out. After that, TC-48 became an absence, one of the most persistent aviation mysteries in Argentine history, spread across a map that, even today, holds more empty space than answers. The Bogs-Begich Cessna, 1972. The final confirmed communication from the Cessna 310 came early in the flight. It was a brief check-in, altitude normal, weather workable, and no sign of trouble. The voice of the pilot sounded relaxed as he crossed into the first stretch of wilderness southeast of Anchorage. Then radio contact faded. Moments later, the aircraft vanished from radar. At first, the silence meant nothing unusual. Radio dropouts were common in the mountains of Alaska. But the next scheduled call never came. Then the next one after that passed without a word. Within an hour, controllers realized the small twin-engine aircraft carrying US Representatives Hale Boggs and Nick Begich, along with the pilot and an aide, had gone quiet for too long. Two timelines now began to run in parallel. One belonged to the flight, a short, simple hop from Anchorage to Juneau. The other belonged to the search, a massive 39-day effort across one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. The Cessna 310 took off on October 16, 1972. It was a routine political travel leg. The plan was straightforward: leave Anchorage, fly southeast through mountain passes toward the coast, then follow the shoreline down to Juneau. The pilot filed the correct flight plan. He checked weather conditions. He reviewed the expected winds aloft. Nothing about the day stood out. The early radios were normal. The Cessna climbed to cruising altitude. Anchorage controllers logged each signal and plotted the aircraft along its route. The map showed a clean arc through the Chugach Mountains, then toward Prince William Sound. Beneath the aircraft lay glaciers, deep valleys and ridges that rose up without warning. Then came the silence. Controllers attempted to raise the Cessna again. Nothing. Other aircraft in the region were asked to listen for any stray transmission. None heard a single tone. The radar track, faint to begin with, disappeared entirely. In Alaska's mountains, radar coverage was never complete. Many flights dipped below the line of sight. But when radio calls also vanished, the concern became immediate. The Air Force was alerted, then the Coast Guard, then civilian search groups. By midday, the region had become the center of one of the largest search missions in US history. The second timeline now advanced minute by minute. Aircraft took off from Elmendorf Air Force Base, sweeping the routes between Anchorage and Juneau. Helicopters flew along mountain ridges, tracing the natural paths pilots used when navigating through the valleys. Coast Guard cutters patrolled waterways, scanning for oil slicks, debris, or floating wreckage. Civilian volunteers, bush pilots, hunters, and local teams joined the effort. But the first difficulty appeared immediately: the map. The Cessna could have fallen anywhere along a route that crossed some of the most rugged terrain in North America. Steep cliffs, heavy forests, glaciers, hidden crevasses and snowfields all swallowed wreckage easily. Even a large aircraft can vanish there without leaving a visible mark from above. A small Cessna could disappear almost completely. Weather complicated the search. Clouds formed quickly along the mountains, fog drifted into valleys, snow squalls reduced visibility. Pilots flew in careful patterns, often slowing to avoid downdrafts or turbulence near ridges. They marked off search sectors on the map and widened them each time they found nothing. Within days, the grid expanded hundreds of square miles. Within a week, thousands. The mystery deepened as investigators reconstructed the flight's timeline. The early weather reports suggested the Cessna flew into areas of low ceiling and patchy visibility. Not severe storms, but enough to force careful flying. The pilot, an experienced Alaskan aviator, likely followed standard valley routes, weaving between mountain walls. But those same valleys held dangers. rising terrain, sudden cloud build-ups, and downdrafts strong enough to push small aircraft onto slopes. No distress call pointed toward a sudden event, mechanical failure, icing, or a collision with terrain. A rapid impact could silence the aircraft instantly. A desperate mayday might never have had time to form. The chain of events inside the cockpit may have lasted only seconds. In the search timeline, those possibilities shaped the grid. Crews scanned tree lines for broken branches, looked for unnatural snow patterns, and surveyed frozen lakes for dark shapes beneath the surface. They followed riverbeds, assuming debris might drift long distances. They searched coastal areas, believing the aircraft might have reached water before losing control. Nothing appeared. The mountains were too vast, the valleys too deep, the forests too dense. Even with hundreds of flight hours logged each day, the search teams found no trace of the Cessna. No oil sheen, no metal fragments, no emergency beacon. As days turned into weeks, the map on the operations wall became covered in coloured pencil. Red for completed search sectors, blue for areas slowed by weather, yellow for zones needing reflights. Each passing day pushed the search outward. Each new line of the grid represented fresh hope that never materialised. Meanwhile, the other timeline, the one belonging to the disappeared, remained frozen at the moment of last contact. A routine transmission, a position report near the mountains, then nothing else. Families waited for news, the public followed every update. The disappearance of 2 US congressmen made headlines across the country. Rumours began circulating, some speculated sabotage. Others pointed toward hijacking. A few imagined hidden crash sites concealed by political motives. Investigators reviewed all possibilities, but evidence for alternative theories never emerged. Without wreckage, nothing could be confirmed or denied. On day 39, the official search ended. Snow was beginning to cover the region. Winter storms would soon make flying impossible. The grid, spanning thousands of square miles of land and sea, held nothing. The Cessna had vanished without leaving a single verifiable clue. After the search ended, the case entered its echo phase. Over the years, private expeditions attempted to find wreckage. Local pilots kept watch during flights. Hikers occasionally reported metallic glints in remote areas. None of these leads were substantiated. Modern analysts later used terrain models and mapping software to simulate the Cessna's potential paths given wind conditions, speed, and altitude. They narrowed likely crash zones to ridges and valleys east of Anchorage, but those areas remain among the least accessible in the region, places where mature forest or heavy snow could hide a small aircraft indefinitely. The disappearance left behind only the early check-ins, the last radar echo, and thousands of coloured squares on a map that never revealed its secret. The final confirmed moment in the aircraft's life is still that calm message over the radio, fading into static over the vast silent wilderness. After that, the Cessna carrying Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, the aide, and the pilot became part of the landscape. Somewhere. Hidden beneath forest canopy, mountain snow, or coastal waters that have refused to yield a single trace for more than half a century. The Edmund Fitzgerald, 1975. The final radio words of Captain Ernest McSorley came late in the afternoon of November 10th, 1975. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot ore carrier, was fighting through one of the worst storms Lake Superior had seen in decades. Winds were howling, waves towered like walls, snow squalls turned day into dusk. Yet McSorley's last message to the nearby freighter, Arthur M. Anderson, was calm, almost understated. "We're holding our own." Minutes later, the Fitzgerald vanished from radar. This moment marks the beginning of a minute-by-minute countdown that ends with one of the Great Lakes' most enduring mysteries. The storm had formed 2 days earlier over the central United States, gathering strength as it tracked northeast. By the time it reached Lake Superior, barometric pressure plummeted, winds surpassed hurricane force in some gusts, and waves rose higher than the pilot house windows on ships across the lake. Veteran captains later said it was the worst weather they had ever seen. The Edmund Fitzgerald was among the largest freighters on the lakes, huge, powerful, and respected for her speed. She left Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with taconite pellets bound for Detroit. The ship's size often made her feel steady in heavy seas, but this storm was different. Waves were breaking over the bow, spray froze on deck equipment. The wind direction pushed water diagonally across the lake, hammering the ship from inconsistent angles. Earlier in the day, the Fitzgerald had reported losing radar. Snow squalls made visibility nearly zero. Without radar, the crew depended on the Arthur M. Anderson behind them for updates on traffic and storm patterns. McSorley also radioed that he had lost fence rails and that vents on the deck were damaged. He reported that the ship was taking on water and that her pumps were running. Yet he kept moving. By late afternoon, the storm reached its peak. The Anderson's crew recorded wind gusts above 70 miles per hour. Waves struck the ship so hard that her deck vibrated with each hit. The captain of the Anderson, Jesse Cooper, maintained distance but stayed close enough to assist if the Fitzgerald needed help. Shortly before 7 p.m, the Anderson called the Fitzgerald to warn of a dangerous wave pattern. Large seas coming from multiple directions, creating unpredictable troughs. Captain Cooper reported 2 massive waves that had just struck his own vessel. He warned the Fitzgerald they were heading her way. McSorley responded with that calm final line, "We are holding our own." That was the last communication. From here, the countdown accelerates. At 7:10 p.m, the Anderson lost radar contact with the Fitzgerald. The blip that had followed her across the lake disappeared suddenly. Not gradually, not drifting off course. One moment it existed. The next moment, it was gone. Crew members on the Anderson peered into the storm, searching for lights through the snow and spray. They saw nothing. The night had turned into a blank curtain of wind and water. Captain Cooper radioed the Coast Guard. He reported the loss of contact. He repeated attempts to raise the Fitzgerald by radio. No answer came back. At this point, the Anderson herself was struggling. The storm was so severe that her wheelsman later said he fought the ship like a wild horse. But despite the danger, the Coast Guard asked Cooper if he could reverse course and head toward the Fitzgerald's last known position. He agreed. Turning in a storm like that was a risk, but Cooper and his crew did it. The ship swung around as waves continued battering her. Her hull groaned under the strain. The Anderson crept back along the plotted line, searching for survivors, life rafts, or floating debris. They found only small pieces, buoys, life jackets, bits of wreckage. No bodies, no rafts, no sign of the ship itself. The countdown had ended in silence. The next day, the Coast Guard began an extensive search. Aircraft flew over a grey churning lake. Ships scanned every coordinate. Weather slowly eased, but the emptiness remained. The Fitzgerald had disappeared so completely that many wondered if the ship had plunged intact straight to the lakebed before anyone aboard could react. Later exploration confirmed the wreck's location. The Fitzgerald lay in 2 main pieces at a depth of more than 500 feet. The bow section sat upright, embedded in the lake floor. The stern section lay twisted and badly damaged. Between them stretched a long debris field of twisted metal, spilled cargo, and scattered equipment. Investigators built a chain of decisions, events, and possibilities. Was the hatch cover integrity compromised? Had the ship lost buoyancy from progressive flooding? Did massive waves hit at the wrong angle? Had the ship nosedived into a trough? Was structural fatigue involved? Each theory matched part of the evidence, none explained everything. The weather that night played a central role. Marine reports describe rogue waves exceeding 30 feet. If 2 such waves struck the Fitzgerald back to back, as the Anderson reported moments earlier, they could have buried the bow, forcing the ship downward faster than the pumps could respond. Another possibility was shoaling. The ship may have passed over a shallow ridge where waves break unpredictably, adding vertical shock to the hull. Yet despite decades of analysis, sonar mapping, and expert review, the exact mechanics of the sinking remained debated. What endured was the understated nature of the final message. "We are holding our own," delivered by a captain with decades of experience on the Great Lakes, trying to guide his ship through a storm that was rising beyond control. In the end, the wreck revealed where the Fitzgerald had gone, but her last moments remain hidden behind wind, water, and the silence that replaced her radar trace in the very instant she disappeared. SS Poet, 1980. The last confirmed message from the SS Poet was simple, routine, and forgettable. The kind of traffic update thousands of ships sent every week. The American bulk carrier had cleared Cape Henlopen off Delaware on a calm October night in 1980, heading east across the Atlantic with a cargo of corn bound for Egypt. The radio call gave position and speed. No warnings, no notes of mechanical trouble, no hint of what was about to occur. Then, almost as soon as the ship passed out of coastal range, she vanished. To understand how a 523-foot vessel can disappear so suddenly, investigators later reconstructed the chain of events. Maintenance decisions, structural vulnerabilities, regulatory gaps, and weather patterns that shaped the hours after that final routine message. But understanding the disappearance also means following the second timeline, the aftermath, when families demanded answers and authorities wrestled with the fact that nothing, no wreckage, no life rafts, no bodies was ever found. The Poet was built in 1944 as a World War II transport ship. She served in military and commercial roles before being converted into a grain carrier. Like many older T2 class vessels, she had a long history of modifications. New engines, new cargo holds, reinforced decks, even changes in ownership. Each change carried small engineering risks. No single alteration seemed enough to threaten a vessel outright. But together they created a ship with aging bones sailing through the strongest storm season on the Atlantic calendar. On October 24th, the Poet departed Philadelphia with 34 crew members and a full load of corn. Her route took her past the Delaware breakwater and into open ocean. The radio call near Cape Henlopen was logged. Normal traffic. A short while later, another message was relayed through regular commercial channels. Still nothing unusual. Then the ocean swallowed the trail. When the ship failed to arrive at Port Said on her expected date, the concern grew rapidly. The Poet maintained scheduled communications on long voyages. Silence was not normal. Shipping companies reached out. Agencies checked logs. No distress calls had been received by the US Coast Guard or any NATO monitoring stations. No merchant ships in the area reported emergency flares or radio traffic. The Coast Guard initiated a search. And suddenly the scale of the problem became clear. The Poet had crossed into the North Atlantic during a period of fierce storms. Weather reports from the time showed a developing system with strong winds, high seas, and shifting pressure fields. But the ship's last known position was vague, a general region rather than a precise coordinate. With no distress signal, search crews didn't know if the ship had veered north, stayed on course, or attempted to avoid a storm cell. They began drawing grid boxes on the map. Lines crossing lines, expanding outward. Each grid represented hours of search flight time. The Coast Guard deployed aircraft and cutters. Navy resources joined in. Merchant vessels in the region extended their lookouts, but the Atlantic was huge, and the storm had churned its surface into an almost featureless pattern of crest and trough. If the Poet had sunk quickly, and quickly was the most accepted scenario, the chance of spotting floating debris was slim. Investigators then returned to the chain of decisions leading up to the voyage. The vessel's age was the first point of concern. Ships built in the mid-1940s were not originally designed for 1980 workloads. Bulk carriers were especially vulnerable to structural stress. Heavy waves could slam the bow hard enough to flex the hull. Older T2 ships had well-documented issues with brittle fractures, especially in cold water or under heavy strain. The North Atlantic in late October provided both. The cargo added weight, literally and structurally. Grain shifts if not perfectly managed. If a large wave caused a sudden roll or pitch, the load could slam from one side of the hold to the other, affecting stability. Even small miscalculations in trimming the ship could become magnified during storms. Then there were questions about maintenance. Questions about watertight integrity. Questions about whether the ship had the structural reinforcement needed for repeated Atlantic crossings. None of these concerns proved a cause. They simply sat in the background, shaping possibilities. The weather system that moved across the Atlantic that week was strong enough to challenge even modern cargo ships. Reports described seas rising above 20 feet with swells from multiple directions. The Poet may have sailed directly into this chaos. A hull breach, sudden flooding, or catastrophic structural failure could have happened in minutes. If the radio antenna was lost early, the crew may not have had a chance to send a distress call. This was one of the most unsettling theories for families, that something so sudden and so silent could sink a vessel of that size without leaving time for even one last message. The aftermath timeline grew tense and emotional as days turned to weeks. The Coast Guard expanded the search to nearly 300,000 square miles. They found nothing. They rechecked the last radio logs, no errors. They interviewed other captains sailing the Atlantic that week. None reported hearing a mayday. Then came the hearings. Families demanded explanations. Engineers presented hull stress models, weather specialists reconstructed storm tracks, maritime officials reviewed safety records. Yet every path circled back to the same conclusion. The poet likely sank in the storm. The exact mechanism of the disaster could not be proven, and without wreckage, every explanation remained incomplete. For the relatives of the 34 missing crew members, the lack of closure left an open wound. They had no final words to hold on to, just a routine message that faded into static. They pushed for further investigation. They examined the company's history. They asked why the vessel sailed that late in the season. They questioned design decisions made decades earlier. They wrote letters, attended hearings, and kept the story alive so it would not join the long list of maritime disappearances forgotten outside shipping circles. But the ocean kept its secret. To this day, the Poet remains one of the largest American merchant ships ever to vanish without a trace. Her last known act was sending a normal traffic report, ordinary words from an ordinary voyage, before slipping beyond the reach of radar, radio and history. The Penlee lifeboat Solomon Brown, 1981. The last clear words from the Solomon Brown lifeboat came through the radio in a voice raised against the noise of a hurricane-strength storm tearing across the Cornish coast. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution crew had fought their way in toward the drifting coaster Union Star, which had lost engine power and was being pushed toward cliffs. After repeated attempts to get close in the darkness and spray, the lifeboat managed to lift several people off the doomed vessel. "We've got 4 off!" That short, breathless message was among their final transmissions. Moments later, all radio contact ended. The night of December 19th, 1981 was defined by rising wind, chaotic seas, and a timeline that moved faster than rescue crews could react. The countdown began long before the Solomon Brown even launched. Earlier that afternoon, the Union Star, a small cargo vessel on her maiden voyage under a new captain, suffered an engine failure as a storm deepened offshore. Winds strengthened quickly, rising into Force 10 and Force 11 conditions, hurricane strength for the region. Calls for assistance were issued as the ship drifted toward the Cornish coastline, its propulsion useless against the gale. Waves grew to the size of small houses, breaking over the ship and sending sheets of water across its deck. Attempts were made to restart the engines. Nothing held. A helicopter rescue was scrambled, but fierce winds prevented a safe winching operation. The coaster spiraled closer and closer to danger, caught in a force it could not escape. As the first timeline unfolded aboard the Union Star, the second timeline began on shore at the Penlee lifeboat station in Mousehole. The pager alarm went out. The volunteer crew, trained and experienced, arrived quickly. They knew the conditions outside were the worst possible for a lifeboat launch, but they launched anyway. The Solomon Brown, a wooden 47-foot lifeboat, pushed into waves that hit her bow like giant hammer blows. Crew members were thrown from side to side. Wind roared at more than 70 miles per hour. Spray froze on exposed surfaces. The sea was a black pit of rising water and collapsing white peaks. As the lifeboat fought toward the Union Star, radio traffic captured the changing conditions in real time. Controllers listened as the lifeboat attempted multiple approaches. The rolling of the two vessels was too unpredictable. On some passes, the ships nearly collided. On others, the lifeboat vanished behind waves so tall they hid it completely from view. The Union Star still drifted toward cliffs. The countdown continued. On one approach attempt, the Solomon Brown reported being thrown off by the swell. On another, the helmsman pushed the boat so close that waves smashed between the two vessels with such force that spray hit the lifeboat's radio aerials. Wind noise bled into every transmission, making sentences hard to hear. Then came the breakthrough. "We've got 4 off!" For a brief moment there was hope. 4 people had been pulled from the sinking coaster. That meant the lifeboat had gotten close enough to make contact, an almost impossible feat in those conditions. The crew had likely timed their approach with the rise of a wave, letting the sea lift them upward before pushing the boat alongside the Union Star long enough for people to jump or be grabbed. But the Union Star still had people aboard, and the coastline was approaching fast. The Solomon Brown prepared to make another approach. Wind strengthened even more, visibility dropped, wave height increased. Radio calls became harder to understand. Transmission quality faded. Countless accounts later described the sound of the storm that night, how it rattled windows miles inland, how gusts twisted trees, how harbours roared like machinery. Out at sea, that same wind must have hit the lifeboat with overwhelming force. After the message about taking 4 off, radio contact became intermittent. Controllers called the lifeboat again and again, no reply. They called the Union Star, no reply. The 2 vessels were still drifting toward the cliffs of Boscawen Point, jagged rock formations where the Atlantic strikes the land with enormous strength. In the next minutes, the countdown entered its final stage. People on shore reported seeing lights near the coastline. Some thought they saw the 2 vessels intertwined in the surf. Others saw nothing at all, only the storm swallowing everything in its path. When the storm briefly eased at dawn, rescue teams searched the area. The sea was still violent, but the first debris from the Union Star washed against the rocks. Nearby, wreckage from the Solomon Brown appeared, broken timbers, fragments of equipment, and flotation gear. Not one of the 16 people aboard the 2 vessels survived. In the aftermath, the emotional timeline began, the part shaped by families, rescuers, and the entire community around the Penlee station. The men on the Solomon Brown had launched knowing the conditions were nearly impossible. They'd gotten close enough to save people when helicopters could not. Their last radio words became a symbol of the night, simple, matter-of-fact, and focused entirely on the mission. "We've got 4 off." The phrase echoed through the inquiry hearings, the funerals, and the memorials. It appeared in news reports and later documentaries. It became a reminder not just of the loss, but of the determination of volunteer lifeboat crews who step into storms most people avoid entirely. Investigators reviewed the events minute by minute and concluded that both vessels likely struck the rocks in the chaos of the final moments. The extreme conditions made it impossible to determine the exact sequence, whether the lifeboat was overwhelmed by a wave, pushed against the coaster, or hit by surf as it made another approach. But the conclusion was clear. The crew had fought until the very last second. The aftermath extended for years. The RNLI honoured the entire Penlee crew with medals. The station was eventually relocated because survivors felt the original site carried too much emotional weight. The story of the Solomon Brown became one of the most respected and solemn chapters in the history of sea rescue. What remains is the contrast between the ordinary tone of the lifeboat's final message and the extraordinary courage behind it. No drama, no panic, only the voice of a crew doing everything possible in a storm that refused to give anything back. The last words live on in recordings and memory, a short message from the middle of hurricane-force chaos. "We've got 4 off!" After that, the storm answered with silence. Taiqing 21, 2008. The final radio message from the Taiqing 21 came on the 28th of October 2008. A routine check-in, a simple verification of position near Kiribati. Nothing unusual was reported. No mechanical trouble, no concerns about weather, no mention of crew issues. For a vessel that spent long stretches of time on the open Pacific, the message was exactly what administrators expected. Then the timeline split. One version followed the vessel as it continued on some unknown path into the night. The other began days later, when the Taiqing 21 was found drifting, burned, abandoned, silent, and surrounded by empty ocean. The Taiqing 21 was a longline fishing vessel, part of the industrial tuna fleet that works in wide arcs across the central Pacific. These ships remain at sea for long periods, often weeks or months, cycling between fishing zones and transshipment points. They operate in remote waters where storms form suddenly, communications can be spotty, and ships often sail beyond the reach of quick rescue. The crew was multinational, Taiwanese officers and deckhands from other countries recruited for long, difficult contracts. Conditions on these vessels vary widely from ship to ship. Some are well maintained, others struggle under heavy use, old equipment, and the constant pressures of industrial fishing. Labour disputes, long hours, and safety concerns are part of the wider context of this kind of work. But on the day of the final transmission, nothing in the message hinted at unrest or danger. After the check-in, the vessel continued on its path through the open water. The Pacific was calm. Weather reports from the region showed typical seasonal conditions: light winds, scattered showers, no major storms. From the outside, the Taiqing 21's voyage seemed uneventful. The other timeline begins on the 9th of November, when another vessel spotted the Taiqing 21 drifting. Something was immediately wrong. The ship's structure was scorched, the deck was damaged by heat, parts of the vessel showed deep burn marks, the lifeboats were missing, no one was on board. The crew, every single person, had vanished. Authorities were notified. When investigators boarded the vessel, they found signs of a fire that had burned intensely. Much of the damage was located near the stern and midsection. Some equipment was melted. There were no signs of a struggle, but also no clues showing how the fire had started. Importantly, nothing indicated that the fire had consumed the entire ship. It looked as though the blaze had been fierce but localized, then burned out naturally as the ship drifted. The investigators faced the first major question in the chain of decisions. If the fire had been survivable, why did the crew abandon the ship? And if they had abandoned it, where were they? The lifeboats were missing. That suggested the crew had deployed them. But the Pacific search that followed, covering thousands of square miles, found no rafts, no debris from a lifeboat, no life jackets, and no human remains. The currents in the region were studied carefully, their paths mapped to model possible drift routes. Nothing matched. This led to the second major question: when exactly had the fire taken place? Investigators knew the last transmission was on October 28th. The ship was found on November 9th. Somewhere between those dates, the Taiqing 21 burned. But satellite imagery offered no clues. No emergency distress beacon had been activated. No Mayday radio message was logged. That silence raised another question. Had the crew been unable to send a distress call? Or had they been prevented from doing so? On many longline vessels, the engine room holds the electrical systems. If the fire began there, it could have disabled the radio almost instantly. Panthers in the fishing industry describe such fires as fast, hot, and difficult to contain. If the blaze cut power early, the crew may have been left with only minutes to react. They may have grabbed the lifeboats, launched into the water, and drifted out of view. But then the timeline hits a dead end, because the crew was never found. Another possibility debated was that the fire broke out later in the voyage, after the ship had already drifted far from its last reported position. The Taiqing 21 could have been without power for days, slowly wandering across open waters. Starved of fuel, the fire may have consumed what it could, then died naturally as oxygen decreased. This would explain the drifting but not the disappearance of the lifeboats or crew. There were also discussions about whether the fire began as an accident, like a fuel leak ignited by an engine spark, or whether human action played a role. In the absence of physical evidence, investigators could not confirm either scenario. Industrial fishing vessels sometimes face internal disputes, dangerous working conditions, or human trafficking issues. But nothing tied the Taiqing 21 to any specific incident. The official inquiry left the cause open. The search for the crew expanded over several days. Aircraft scanned the sea surface in patterns extending outward from the ship's driftline. Ships rerouted to assist. Kiribati authorities joined the effort. But the Pacific is vast. A lifeboat can vanish into its horizon easily. And if the lifeboat capsized in rough water at any point during the missing days, no trace would remain. The empty, burned vessel created profound absence. A ghost ship without survivors. A last radio message without warning. A timeline that ends with questions instead of answers. In the aftermath, the families of the missing men received no closure. They were told the fire likely began suddenly, that electrical failure could have prevented communication, and that the crew may have fled in lifeboats that later succumbed to the open sea. But these explanations were theories, not conclusions. The case revealed deeper concerns about the global fishing fleet. Aging vessels operating far from oversight, crews working in isolation, safety standards that varied widely across jurisdictions. For investigators, every attempt to reconstruct the chain of events ran into the same barrier: the quiet gap between the last routine check-in and the moment the drifting hulk was discovered. On October 28th, the crew of the Taiqing 21 sent a message that sounded like any other day at sea. By November 9th, the ship floated alone, burned, silent, and stripped of every sign of human life. Between those 2 points lies a stretch of time the Pacific has refused to give back. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 2014. The final radio words from Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 came at 1:19 a.m. local time on March 8, 2014. The Boeing 777 was leaving Malaysian airspace, climbing through a quiet night sky on its way from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Air traffic control instructed the crew to hand off to the next sector. The reply was calm, ordinary, and delivered in the same measured tone pilots use hundreds of times a day. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Nothing in the voice suggested trouble. Nothing hinted at what was unfolding just ahead. Yet minutes later, the aircraft's transponder, its electronic identification, stopped transmitting. The jet then deviated sharply from its assigned route. Those simple words marked the last confirmed human contact with MH370, and what followed became one of the most complex maps of vanishing in aviation history. When the transponder went silent, civilian radar lost the aircraft. But military radar later showed a very different story. MH370 did not fall into the sea immediately after that last call. Instead, it turned west, far off its planned path, and crossed the Malaysian peninsula. It then followed a track over the Strait of Malacca, before radar contact finally faded over the open ocean. Investigators recreated this path second by second. Each turn, each altitude change, each segment of the route became part of a timeline that no one had expected to see. The aircraft's movements were deliberate enough to suggest human control, but the lack of radio communication contradicted every standard procedure. Pilots who lose communication are trained to continue on course. MH370 did not. After leaving military radar coverage, the aircraft entered a part of the world where only satellites could detect it. The Inmarsat system, which monitors data from aircraft systems, picked up a series of hourly handshakes, automated signals showing that the aircraft's satellite equipment was still powered. These handshakes formed the backbone of the next timeline. Each handshake placed MH370 along a large arc stretching across the Indian Ocean. Not a precise line, an arc hundreds of miles wide, but enough to show one thing clearly: the aircraft was still flying for hours. Investigators plotted these arcs across a map of the southern hemisphere. By comparing fuel burn estimates, speed ranges, and the timing of the handshakes, they narrowed the likely flight path to a long descent into remote waters west of Australia. This area, far from shipping lanes, flight paths, or islands, is one of the loneliest places on Earth. Search crews raced to the zone. Australian, Malaysian, and international teams began scanning ocean surfaces, then the seafloor. The search became one of the most extensive ever undertaken. Ships used sonar to map the seabed. Aircraft dropped listening devices into the water to detect potential pings from the aircraft's recorders. Oceanographers modelled drift patterns. Meteorologists studied winds and currents back to the beginning. Every piece of data went into building a picture of the missing jet's final hours. But the Indian Ocean is vast. Weeks passed, then months, then years. In 2015, the first confirmed debris washed ashore on Reunion Island, thousands of miles from the search zone. The part was a flaperon from a Boeing 777, and experts tied it directly to MH370. Later, pieces of interior panels, wing fragments, and other components appeared along coastlines in the western Indian Ocean. Drift analysis confirmed they had likely come from the same general region. But these finds, while important, did not pinpoint the wreck's resting place. The map of vanishing widened once again. The investigation turned into a series of branching questions, each one tied to the chain of decisions that may have unfolded inside the cockpit. Aviators, engineers, and accident analysts reviewed possibilities: a sudden decompression, a cockpit fire, an electrical failure, crew incapacitation, a hijacking, deliberate action by someone on board. None of the theories fully matched all available evidence. Some explained the radio silence, but not the route change. Others explained the route, but not the steady flight hours afterward, and without the flight recorders, the exact sequence inside the cabin remained unknown. The search area, shaped by satellite mathematics and ocean drift models, shifted several times. The original operation was suspended. A private company resumed the search later, using advanced underwater scanning systems. Both efforts mapped huge portions of ocean floor never charted before. Neither found the wreck. Meanwhile, the emotional timeline expanded far beyond the map. Families from China, Malaysia, Australia, and many other countries waited for answers. For them, the last words, Goodnight Malaysian 370 became a haunting reminder of how normal everything had sounded. They pressed for more information, more searches, more transparency. Some travelled to the drift zones, others studied radar data and satellite theory themselves. Many simply waited, grappling with the strange absence of closure. As the years passed, the case entered the realm of global aftershocks. Aviation authorities re-examined long-range communication procedures. New standards were proposed for real-time aircraft tracking. Airlines reviewed their onboard safety and reporting systems. Countries debated the balance between military radar secrecy and civilian air safety. The disappearance reshaped aviation policy as deeply as any major accident, despite the fact that the accident itself remained unresolved. Today, the map of MH370's vanishing still exists as a series of arcs, drift models, and hypothesis lines, precise in mathematics, uncertain in meaning. The southern Indian Ocean holds the likely answer, somewhere far below the surface, beyond the reach of light and human eyes. What remains on the surface are those final routine words. They were spoken in a voice that reflected neither fear nor confusion, a simple farewell between pilots and controllers. "Good night, Malaysian 370, a normal phrase at the edge of a flight path that would become one of the most perplexing mysteries of the modern era. After that, the world waited for a message that never came, while the jet travelled on, hour after hour, into empty ocean, beyond all radar, beyond all communication, and eventually, beyond all certainty. Across all these events, one pattern remains: ordinary messages before extraordinary loss. Routine check-ins, calm voices, simple updates, and then nothing. Search teams looked for wreckage, families waited for answers, and investigators tried to rebuild final moments from fragments of evidence. Some cases left clues, others left only questions. What stays with us are those last words, frozen in time. Short phrases carried across radios that now mark the point where each story turns from certainty into mystery.